In 2021, WSOU's Election Night Show won the New York Press Club Award for Metro political coverage. Now, Election Night is back this Super Tuesday at 8 p.m. for one of the most important dates on the political calendar. Tune in for live results and hear our analysts break down the 2024 presidential election cycle only on 89.5 FM WSOU.
Hello and welcome to this Super Tuesday Election Night coverage show. I'm Ryan Henry, joined alongside Dovid Holtzman. You'll be hearing from us and an array of WSOU newscasters for the next couple hours as we break down Super Tuesday Election Night results as they happen. Before we get into kind of breaking down everything that's happened before and how we got here today, how are you doing, Dovid?
I'm doing okay. I kind of think it's politics as the sports for nerds. And the Super Tuesday primary is not quite the Super Bowl. We're going to get that in the fall. And a quick shameless plug for WSOU, you are going to want to tune in to WSOU's award-winning coverage of the 2024 election this November. Tonight is the preview. Tonight, we understand the primary itself is not going to be the most competitive. Joe Biden has already won, I'm looking right now, 4 primary states by margins of not less than 80 points. And it's a little bit more competitive in the Republican primary. But tonight is not the Super Bowl. But tonight, we're going to break down for you, the listeners, how we're going to get there, where we came from, what the big talking points are this election, and how we are going to go, what the path is to go from March to November. How are you, Ryan?
I'm doing all right, and actually, I'm gonna spin things back. If you want to go for another analogy, it's for our college basketball listeners out there. This is kind of like every Thanksgiving they have these in-season tournaments before the season begins. You have the Maui Invitational, the Battle for Lance, the Ratty Children's Invitational, where you get a collection of these Power Conference teams to come together, play before Thanksgiving. It's not the Super Bowl, it's not the March Madness tournament, but it's a precursor to what we'll get to see later on this season. I think that's what we're dealing with right now here on Super Tuesday. So, kind of recapping everything before we get back into the swing of things. So, we are dealing with the Super Tuesday is when 16 states and 1 territory, American Samoa, is up for the primary, up for primaries. But we've had a couple of primaries and caucuses before it. The Iowa caucus was the first one. Donald Trump won that in convincing fashion. Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy were still in the election, picked up a couple of delegates as well before they dropped out. Nikki Haley stayed in as well. She was the third candidate, had the third most delegates from that caucus with 8, picked up a couple in New Hampshire as well, a tightly contested race in terms of delegates. And then Donald Trump has really been taking over for the rest of this primary cycle leading up, with the exclusion of Washington, D.C., which Nikki Haley won just back on Monday. Right, so we know the Super Tuesday and also the purpose of our shows for our listeners. For the most part, we know what's going to happen, but I think we want this to serve as kind of a precursor for how we got here in general, the bigger storylines of, the Republican primary leading up to it, Joe Biden's presidency, and what can we expect for 2024, or expect in November.
That's exactly right. And we've curated the talking points for you tonight. So we're going to break down exactly each of those steps. So right after our opening segment, we're going to have Anthony Collins and Jorge Rivera on, and they're going to break down the first Republican candidates that dropped out after that Iowa caucus. In that Iowa caucus, on January 15th, Trump came away with 51% of the vote. It was a big talking point leading up to that caucus of, is Trump technically an incumbent? Now, he's not, because Biden is in the White House right now. But does Trump have incumbent? Do voters see Trump as having incumbent status? Well, in Iowa, arguably they did, giving him a majority of the vote, setting a few records for vote share. And right after that, Vivek Ramaswamy dropped out the same night. He got 7.6% of the vote. Not a surprise, as he ran along almost the exact same lines that Trump did. And then a few days later came the real surprise when Ron DeSantis dropped out. So we're going to break that down for you. Jorge and Anthony are going to break down the Ron DeSantis and the Vivek Ramaswamy campaigns. What did they do right? What did they do wrong? And why are they no longer in the race?
Yeah, and I want to give a little bit of a buffer before we head into our first break, because this is kind of an introduction of what we want to do and what we want to lay out. But leading up to it, so the big number of delegates, the magic number we're searching for the entire primary cycle is 1,215. 11% of those have already been decided in the previous primaries or caucuses. But the reason why tonight is called Super Tuesday is because 865 delegates will be dispersed out, shared out to the candidates. And actually, we already have a live result, at least on the Republican side, of one of the states already being decided. A couple already being called for. Donald Trump will win Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee. Now, certain states, the way this works out for those listening at home who may not be familiar, it's based on certain states. So certain states have outright. So if you win the state, you'll outright win all the delegates. Some it's based on a model of if you reach a certain threshold, and the rest it's like based on voter distribution. So we'll see how those delegates get split up, but that is what we're looking at right now. Like I mentioned before, Nikki Haley's only won D.C. Donald Trump has won every other state, most of them in convincing fashion. But Dovid, if you have any other talking points, I think we can kind of take a quick little break, and then we can kind of send it over to Jorge and Anthony if they want to discuss, the previous the two candidates who were here, the two main candidates and other candidates who were involved in the primary but have dropped out, especially very early, because another talking point we can mention a little bit before we get into things. It's unprecedented for essentially the presidency or the candidate, especially of the non-incumbent party, although Trump is, like you said, maybe an incumbent, maybe not be, is already decided by this point.
Very, very rare. And Trump, with 200 plus delegates coming in tonight, can win another 865 delegates tonight. That's not going to add up if he wins all of them, which is possible. The really tight race we're going to watch tonight is Vermont. Results are already coming in. Trump is +6 now, but the New York Times Needle, which I consider the gold standard for predicting results, has Trump winning by just 0.6. So that's going to be your closest result tonight. In terms of, I want to break down a little bit of a preview for how tonight's going to look. So we already got a few states closed. We got Iowa, Virginia, Vermont, North Carolina, Tennessee. A number of those states have already been called, right? In terms of the Republican primary, Trump's already been called for Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee. Let's break down what's coming later tonight. At 8 o'clock, just 10 minutes ago, 4 more states closed. Alabama, Massachusetts, which is the most favorable state for Haley, except for Vermont, Maine, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and parts of Texas. Tennessee's already been called for Trump. 8:30, we're going to get Arkansas. 9 o'clock, Colorado, Minnesota, and the rest of Texas. At 10 o'clock, or between 10 and 11, we're going to get the close at Utah. 11 o'clock, and this is the one election that's real tonight. And depending on how late we go, maybe we'll have results. California closes at 11. The Democrat primary for Senate in California to replace the late Dianne Feinstein is going to determine tonight who will be the next senator for California. That's maybe the most practical race to come away with tonight. And finally, Alaska's not going to close until 12 o'clock. But until then, we got the analysts in studio to break down all of these topics.
Yeah, we definitely do, and I'm excited to get into it. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to play some regular rotation music, but we'll come back. Anthony and Jorge will be back, and we'll break down the other Republican candidates who failed to make, not failed, but who were also in this race and eventually had dropped out. Nikki Haley will get her own separate section later on. You've been listening to WSU's Election Night coverage. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Hello and welcome back to our Election Night news coverage. I am Ryan Henry, Ryan Henry wanted to bring you back. One more state has been called. Donald Trump has won Oklahoma. That is in addition to him winning Vermont, North Carolina, and Tennessee. But I'm going to send it over to Anthony Collins and Jorge Rivera. Will they be bringing down the previous Republican candidates who failed to object Donald Trump and, have dropped out of the race since we have started this election cycle. Take it away, guys.
Yeah, so to add on to that, as we've seen for Virginia, a lot more moderate Democratic voters have leaned towards Haley, whereas more extreme voters towards Trump. But when we look at the failed Republican candidates, starting off Ron DeSantis, who is named sword after dominating the midterms, winning a decisive 60% of the votes, elevating Florida from a swing state to a definitive red state. Vivek, who exploded in popularity during presidential campaign. When we look at the reason why Haley has survived for so long is by Haley smartly using her foreign affairs experience to uplift herself against Vivek, who had more lack of knowledge in foreign policy. Although Vivek does have a bright future ahead of him, sharing, smartly enough, he shared a lot of ideals with Trump. Ron DeSantis did not do a good job of that, as he, thought that his more extreme ideals would push past Trump voters, but as loyal Trump voters did not bite on that. Whereas Haley did a good job sticking with her policies, and she's done a good job in Vermont, as we see. She's won that.
Right, so Anthony, thank you. I want to also thank you just for starting off the great conversation. I'm looking forward to talking about another few of the Republican candidates who either have dropped out of the race or, like Nikki Haley, are still in it. And we're seeing now with the results of the primaries that it's going to be sort of an interesting few hours here as we analyze the results of the various primaries. We're looking at Vermont, where it's turning out to be a very close race. But before anything, I first wanted to talk a little bit about Nikki Haley. Why don't we start off with Nikki Haley, a little bit about her past. As we know, she was a governor of South Carolina from 2011 to 2017. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations from 2017 to 2018. And then one talking point that the Trump side would like to bring up is the fact that she was a board member under Boeing. And so when we talk about this sort of hesitancy from the I would say the Trump voter base regarding Haley, they say that she is a warmonger, which is a term that Trump frequently uses to describe Nikki Haley. And one of the reasons for this term being used is the fact that she was a board member under Boeing, which of course is a aircraft manufacturer as well as missiles as well. But of course, what I want to ask Anthony is, where do Haley and Trump differ in terms of policy? I think this is a question that a lot of people have.
So from a foreign policy aspect, we see Haley much more for foreign aid with Ukraine and their war against Russia and with Israel, whereas Trump has taken more of an isolationist approach when it comes to both nations in war. Trump is more, same with immigration, as he's much more extreme on border control, as we've seen throughout his presidency, with the border wall, stricter deportation programs, although they both agree on reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy executed by Trump's administration. But, as a U.S. ambassador in Trump's cabinet, Haley, she really set herself apart with not only Trump, but the rest of the Republican candidates. But her support, as having more experience, she is more sympathetical towards other nations in war, whereas Trump hasn't talked about it much in terms of where Israel is right now. But he did say today that he hopes Israel ends the job that they're doing. So as he does support Israel, he doesn't seem that he wants America to have too much of an involved in the war at this point.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, isolationist policy. And I think he is taking the America First approach, as we've seen the same with Vivek Ramaswamy, who earlier dropped out of the race. And not to mention that, in terms of Israel and just more general foreign policy like Ukraine, what we're seeing is Haley and Trump agreeing on aid to Israel and eliminating Hamas. And then in terms of Ukraine, that's where the two differ. I think Haley, what we've seen is that she continues to support aid, while Trump is more leaning towards peace talks and wanting to end the war as a whole. I also had another question, Anthony, if you want to go ahead and answer this one, is we're seeing a lot of the ideas of alternatives to Trump on the GOP side. Is there any possibility, in your opinion, that there could be an alternative to Trump?
No, I do not. As we've seen, we've seen moderate candidates try to take him down. We've seen more far right, as we've seen DeSantis. He's claimed that Trump does not go far enough on abortion. We've seen Vivek try to mimic a lot of his ideals, and he's failed to do so. So it doesn't seem like, as of right now, there is a candidate out there that could really beat Trump. I mean, Vivek, who exploded popularity, obviously, his loyalty towards the former president, he did a good job there. It more so looked like an approach to try to get that VP spot rather than truly beating him. So I don't see really, even Haley, we don't see. So, I don't think there's a candidate out there that could truly turn Trump voters as of right now to themselves.
I'm also on the same page as you, to be honest. And what I'm sort of seeing is there's a lot of support coming from the GOP, from former Trump allies and as well as current Trump allies, and a lot of endorsements, and a few of which I'd like to mention. Of course, some more obvious ones like Ben Carson, who was former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, who was working on the border situation on Texas, which is more recent news. Doug Burgum, who is a former GOP candidate who was running against Trump more recently until he dropped out of the race, and also governor of North Dakota. Ron DeSantis again, another. Javier Milei, who has been in the media a lot as of late, president of Argentina. And then a few others that I would mention here, but I don't want to go on and on. But I do also want to say that as of now, what we're seeing is the party is almost deciding that it's going to be Trump as of now. And of course, it is a little early to call as we are here Super Tuesday. We're seeing a lot of different opportunities. One in particular, as I mentioned earlier, is Vermont for Nikki Haley. It has not been called, but we're still looking at that very closely. But up until today, we've seen primaries. Let me list a few states here. Idaho, Nevada, North Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, Michigan, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and not a state, but still had a primary, the Virgin Islands, all who had decided it would be Trump. And so I agree with you, Anthony. What we're seeing here is a lot of support from the party in general, and it seems like the name that comes out at the end will be Trump. So the only thing I also wanted to add was I wanted to talk a bit about Ron DeSantis as well. We talked about Nikki Haley, but Ron DeSantis also seemed to be a big player early on in the race, I should say. So what I want to know really is, what did he accomplish in Florida? Why was he so popular? What was the big movement as he started his bid?
So obviously he elevated Florida. So when he came into Florida, everyone viewed Florida as mainly a swing state, and he turned into a definitive red state. And so everyone thought he had a lot of momentum coming out of Florida going into his presidential campaign. But he definitely revealed his inexperience in his first presidential campaign. He definitely underperformed in the Iowa caucus. His strategy of going after diehard Trump supporters, it ultimately failed. He believed his far-right policies would help him win Iowa, because a lot of the voters were far-right. But it did not work, as Trump did win by a significant margin. But I thought after dropping out of the race, him immediately endorsing Trump, you always know the former president has always expressed respect back when people endorsed him. And, DeSantis still holds a significant power in Florida, so he can shift policy towards his liking and use it for his next presidential campaign in the future.
Do you think that's where it might have gone wrong, where he's running against Donald Trump, who had a big movement to begin with? A lot of the applause that on the right, looking at DeSantis' handling of the COVID policies down in Florida during the pandemic.
Yes, I think DeSantis took I'm going to be more extreme towards Trump's beliefs. He figured he'd draw his voters towards him by doing that. But, it didn't work. A lot of loyal voters, they really trusted Trump to get the job done. A lot of them thought, even though DeSantis, he was more extreme on abortion and other issues, they didn't really truly believe that he actually was, and he was just doing it for his campaign to get ahead of Trump. So, he wasn't able to draw Trump voters, and that ultimately led to him dropping out of the race.
Understood completely. And, of course, there are many other figures that we can talk about, but one name that comes up in particular, of course, is Vivek Ramaswamy. I know he was all over social media after the debates, the Republican primary debates. I believe hosted with a few different cable news networks as well as video streaming platform Rumble. But what we're seeing is very interesting because he was the youngest candidate. He was 38 years old. I'll give you a bit of a background on him. He is 38 years old, born in Ohio, an entrepreneur who founded the drug development company Roviant Sciences. So my question, I suppose, is what was behind his rise?
Well, the thing with Vivek Ramaswamy is he believed he was leading a strong movement of young Republican voters that initially supported Trump prior to his sudden rise in his run for president. This obviously didn't last long for Vivek. He found himself losing multiple debates. He had a lot of popularity. It exploded going into it. Him throwing accusations merely towards Haley. Haley came back, exposed Vivek for his lack of knowledge in foreign policy. Vivek found himself kind of in a hole. But Vivek does have a bright future ahead of him. Seen as loyal in Trump's eyes, extremely popular with Republican voters. He obviously, as we could see, he hopes to serve in Trump's administration. He has a very strong chance of entering Trump's cabinet in one of those lower departments, being on the short list of VP.
That's another thing. He's looks to be at least in the name pool for vice president under Trump. And then I suppose one other thing is what exactly were some of his political positions? Because we know a lot about his personality based on how he conducted himself on camera, of course, but where did he really stand on the issues?
Like what I said, I thought he's more of an isolationist, just like Trump. His ideals are nearly identical, as they share fairly similar, not so much nationalistic, but more so, expressing his loyalty towards him. And it helped him in the short run, but in terms of really winning the election, I don't see that he had a true approach towards that.
And I just want to add on to that because isolationists, just like Trump, America first, as we've seen with Trump. But of course, there's a few other bullet points I would just like to add here that, according to Vivek, he wants to revive what he's calling a national identity that's missing in the country right now. He is agreeing with Trump on ending birthright citizenship. He's a Second Amendment absolutist. And then one interesting point that I made a note of, which not a policy I've heard at all, actually, is that he's interested in shutting down the FBI and redistributing the funds, which seems to be a very interesting move, not something I've heard. And then, just like Trump, seeking peace in Ukraine. So the natural question that follows is, what is his future in politics now that he's dropped out of the race? Say if he does VP, but what comes in the 2028 election season? Potentially anything there?
Yeah, definitely. The name Vivek Ramaswamy, he is not going away for sure. He's got a real young Republican movement right now. He obviously exploded rapidly during the beginning of his campaign for president, so he is not going away. He's very young. Obviously he's very loyal for Trump. So, I don't want to say that his upside is VP for Trump. He obviously has a strong movement. He's still very young. He has a potential. So, his upside is a lot bigger than what it sounds like, what I'm saying. But I do predict that he was really going for VP this year. But we'll have to see what his political future holds. But
we'll have to see indeed. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add there. As we covered Vivek Ramaswamy, an interesting player in the field right now. Is there anything else there that you have, Anthony?
No, how about you, man?
All right. Well, my name is Jorge Rivera, and that was Anthony Collins. Pleasure doing segment, and we'll be covering RFK Jr. in the coming segments as well.
Peace.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Jorge. I've been Ryan Henry. Wanted to make another announcement before we take a quick break. Maine has also been called in favor of Donald Trump. We are going to be taking a quick break. Coming up next, me and Dovid and I will be back discussing Donald Trump's criminal trials and the impact it could potentially have on this election. You've been tuning to 89.5 FM at WSOU, the Marconi award-winning radio station. We're going to take a quick break, go play a little bit of music, and we'll be right back talking Donald Trump criminal trials.
In 2021, WSOU's Election Night Show won the New York Press Club Award for Metro political coverage. Now, Election Night is back this Super Tuesday at 8 p.m. for one of the most important dates on the political calendar. Tune in for live results and hear our analysts break down the 2024 presidential election cycle only on 89.5 FM WSOU.
Hello and welcome back to this coverage of WSU Election Night coverage here on 89.5 FM WSOU. I'm Ryan Henry, joined alongside Dovid Holtzman for our next topic of conversation. We are going to be talking about Donald Trump's criminal trials.
Welcome back, Ryan.
Welcome back indeed. There's a lot to unpack here. It's still even an ongoing process because the Stormy Daniels court situation, where if you're not familiar, it was in the early 2000s, I believe, 2006. Donald Trump had one of his lawyers pay her hush money, and then they filed it as like business expenses. And that case is still going on. He's going back on trial in 20 days to deal with that dispute, and he's already dealt with a lot of criminal charges. He's been indicted on 4 different ones already. Before we break down each individual charges, Dovid, what
Ryan,
do you make of the general criminal trials? Because with everything that happens with Donald Trump's presidency, good and bad, it feels like everything's unprecedented. He is the first president to be criminally charged, and he's gotten charged for multiple counts.
There was a president in, I think it was the 1850s, who was charged with speeding. He was going too fast in his carriage. It might have been, the presidency was over. He was going a little too fast in his carriage. He was speeding. He got pulled over. He got pulled over again. On the second time, he was charged with speeding in his horse and buggy. The criminal charges are probably the most controversial elements of the 2024 election cycle. And that's no matter how you approach this thing. There's a political breakdown where there's so much argumentation, hatred even, maybe, vitriol between the two partisan sides over these political trials. So you have the questions, right? You have 2 big questions. Number 1, is Trump guilty of any of the things he's being charged with? Maybe. It's quite possible. Some might even say it's quite likely. And then number 2 is you have the question, are these charges politically motivated? Maybe. It's possible. Is it likely? So you have these controversial points coming from both sides. But let's get into the actual cases that Trump is being confronted with, he's being charged with, that he's being charged with over the last few months in this historic time period.
Yeah, and before we get deep into them, I want to say, he's already been indicted on a couple, so you have to say, is he actually guilty or not? But I think the politically charged ones, I think the one with the most evidence of it being politically motivated or charged is obviously the main one that has to do directly with the election, which was over down in
D.C.
In D.C., where he got where he got charged for trying to overturn the 2020 election. Obviously, we know the whole insurrection. What his actual role in that is a little murky, but that's probably the most politically motivated because, there's some people who say he did start incite an insurrection. Other people are saying that he was just having a speech, and there were other, protesters who had extra means of, trying to enforce I don't know if enforce the policy is what I want to say, but they had extra means on addition to what Donald Trump was trying to push. So I think that's probably the most politically charged. I think also what's been going down in Mar-a-Lago, where he's been, hoarding these classified documents. Some of them are politically based. So I think those are probably the two of the big four we're talking about that probably have to deal with Donald Trump as a politician.
Those are definitely the two strongest cases. The charges brought by Jack Smith in D.C., which include conspiracy against rights, that Trump conspired to take away the rights of the people to vote for the candidates of their choice, and the charges in Miami, in the Southern District of Florida, where Trump is charged with misusing classified documents, of holding a document in the air, talking with ordinary civilians, and saying, I could have declassified these, I didn't, but look at this, kind of. So the irony of this is that the Florida charges are probably the strongest charges against him. But because it is South Florida and because the judge in the case is Aileen Cannon, who was appointed by Donald Trump, it's also quite possibly the suit that Trump is most likely to be acquitted of. And then D.C. is the opposite. It's beyond the scope of this analysis, but there are those, you can make the case that the D.C. charges were the weakest of any of the charges against him. But because the Washington, D.C. jury system, and Washington, D.C. jury pool is so far to the left in a raid against President Trump, not one January 6th defendant has been acquitted. That is, acquitted entirely. D.C. is actually the place where Trump is most likely to be convicted.
No, yeah, and I mean, also kind of piggybacking on the D.C. talk, and I assume if the people who are discussing Nikki Haley, I believe it's Joe and Liam, Nikki Haley won the D.C. primary, and that's the only state she has won outright. So you're talking about a lot of personal biases maybe coming into effect there, like you said, because it's not like the Mar-a-Lago incident where this case is very strong. The Stormy Daniels case where it was put on file that they were paying this person off and they were federally charged. Donald Trump, you can't say it was directly related to him. There's an argument to be made, but it's not as, the evidence isn't as concrete as some of the other cases. But like you said, where where the case is being tried in, and in previous cases involving January 6th, it's probably the case that he might receive the harshest punishment on.
Right. Now, a prominent Democrat election lawyer, Mark Elias, he litigated the Bush v. Gore case. He tweeted yesterday, in a city of 700,000, that's D.C., Donald Trump got 676 votes in the GOP primary. Tough jury pool. So that's right. Trump does face an uphill battle, particularly in D.C. Now, that case is on hold at the moment. Trump's lawyers have appealed, and that went to the D.C. Court of Appeals, and they lost. And it was appealed from the D.C. Court of Appeals to the United States Supreme Court. Trump's lawyers argue that actually a president cannot be indicted for anything he did while in office, ranging from petty theft to murder. You couldn't actually indict a president at all. And the argument there is that the Constitution sets out a process for indicting a president, and that goes through Congress. And that's the impeachment and conviction process in the House and the Senate, respectively. So they argue that whether or not Trump tried to subvert the 2020 election, you couldn't actually even charge him with it. Now, is he going to win on that appeal? Probably not. It's a little bit of an out there argument. There's some logic to it, but it's a little bit of an out there argument. He's not going to appeal. He's not likely to win. But, and this is the key, is Trump's strategy with these trials is to push off the date of the trial as far as he possibly can in order so that the trial doesn't take place before the election. So the moment the election's over, Trump can just pardon himself.
No, yeah, and I mean, it's also like the argument that they're making about, well, one, a president can't be tried while in office. It's also kind of describing the murky lines of when he is technically I guess, out of office, because it was during the inauguration of President Joe Biden when everything went down. Is it that the date, since Biden had already won the election and had already won so much, or had it already been, what? It's in November, about 2 months before, or is it Donald, he has not officially been sworn in? It's weird of the transfer of powers. I agree with you, it's a little murky, but at the end of the day, like you said, he's playing a time game here because it's March 5th, 2024, general elections in November. He's just trying to delay everything because, like you say, he's trying to get to November because if he wants president and it's in November, he can pardon himself.
Now, there's one state, and this is the trial with the most drama, right? We can hand out awards, right? Most likely to be convicted award, Washington, D.C. Strongest case award goes to Miami. Most drama award goes to Georgia. And that's the RICO charges that Trump was hit with. America's former mayor, Rudy Giuliani, was hit with. A number of Trump operatives were hit with, and they were hit with a RICO violation. And what a RICO violation is, it says basically we can't really find evidence of a crime, but we can find evidence of a conspiracy to commit a crime. And this was developed in order to take on the mob. And actually, Rudy Giuliani, as New York's Attorney General, he pioneered a lot of the legal scholarship around RICO cases. Now, in Georgia, if Trump were elected, he couldn't actually pardon himself because the president doesn't have the power to pardon state charges. In Georgia, actually, charges go not through the governor, Brian Kemp, a Republican who doesn't particularly like Trump. They go through a board of appeals. So Trump, actually, if he's convicted there and he were elected president, he wouldn't be able to pardon his way out of a sentence.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting case. It's always funny because, like you said, a lot of it was involved in the RICO charges. And Rudy Giuliani, the man who I would say the kind of the forefather of all of it, like you said, was the one who the big thing was taking down the mob. He got suckered right in the mid. I guess it's the whole. I don't know if it's really an irony because is it ironic for a guy who wanted to take down organized crime to also be charged of organized crime? But it is very funny, like you said, to go down. And it is also very interesting because, as you mentioned, Trump can't pardon himself like he can with some of these other criminal charges. So it will be interesting to see how everything goes. But there's that charge, and then obviously the charge that has been making waves recently has been the two in New York City. You have the Stormy Daniels situation, which is still ongoing as well. And then he recently got charged in a civil lawsuit. New York Attorney General Letitia James sued Donald Trump and the Trump Organization about the assets, lying about the amount of assets he had. She also accused them of scheming and duping banks. There was the original ruling that Donald Trump could not operate businesses in New York. That got overturned. Now he can, but he still has to pay. It was the original settlement was
$454 million.
Yeah, $355 million. Now it's $454 million
plus interest.
Plus interest added on top of that as well. So very interesting how he's dealing with he's being attacked, not being attacked. He's being charged from all these different angles. And this has been the most recent just because, one, it deals with our area of the New York, New Jersey area, but also it's been the one that's been the most recently developing.
Right, and you mentioned those two cases in New York. The third case in New York was the E. Jean Carroll sexual assault defamation lawsuits. Now, he was acquitted of the sexual assault charge. He was convicted of the defamation charge in the E. Jean Carroll suit. She accused Trump of raping her in the dressing room of Bergdorf Goodman's at some point back in the 1990s. You got three cases coming out of New York. One thing I wonder is if we let all this play out in an alternate universe where Trump was never charged. He was never charged by Alvin Bragg in the Stormy Daniels case. He was never charged in the Southern District of Florida, not in D.C. Does Trump even run, or does he just retire? He's in his late 70s. He's not as old as Joe Biden, but if not for Joe Biden, he would still be the oldest man elected president ever. Does Trump kind of just want to sit on the beach in Mar-a-Lago and watch the sunset? And if he wasn't indicted, is that what would have happened?
I would have to say no. I think I agree with you I agree with the sentiment that I agree with your idea that he's trying to pardon himself, but I also think he enjoys being president. I don't think he wants to be president solely to pardon himself. It's definitely a factor. It could be maybe the main factor, but I think he has the love of the game outside of it, because none of these charges were active. I mean, people had known about the Stormy Daniels stuff had been known, before, but a lot of the new stuff had developed in the 2 years or so in between when he lost in 2020 and now.
And when Joe Biden took office.
Yes.
That 3-month stretch between November and January 21st,
yeah,
when Joe Biden took office, is when a lot of this stuff really came to the forefront. And then now Trump forced to defend himself. It's interesting to consider as maybe in an alternate history. Historians can go over this. So about the RICO case, something that came out in Atlanta, which is it just makes things more interesting. Trump was charged in Fulton County, that's Atlanta, by the DA, Fani Willis. She's now under investigation for ethics violations. Now, she hired to her team in order to prosecute Trump someone named Nathan Wade. And there's now a significant amount of evidence, some court testimony, cell phone records, indicating that the person she hired was someone that she was in a relationship with before she hired him. So, was she using and this is someone who then bought her tickets for vacations, for planes. She claims that she paid him back. But the court case has done a complete 180 and is bogged down with the discussion of, well, did Fani Willis commit ethics violations in charging Donald Trump? This goes with the slowdown strategy.
Yeah, it definitely does, and it adds to your validity of kind of just, trying to stall things out. Definitely is something that she, the Vance Williams is dealing with, and look, we don't know definitively what's the situation on that, but I want to transition a bit, still kind of sticking on the topic of Donald Trump being convicted, indicted.
Go for it.
Do you think we're talking about, it is so strange, and this is what I want to talk about. It is so strange that a candidate who has been so polarizing in his now dating back to, I guess,
2015. 2015, the escalator ride.
He first decides. So in his which is kind of crazy to think about, his 9 years as a political figure, no one has been more polarizing. No one has been more polarizing than him.
Right.
He won the general election in 2016. He had the second highest voter turnout in 2020, losing to the guy who had the highest.
Right.
And now you have these criminal cases. A guy who's very polarizing in his own right, who, anyone you can ask to, if you ask a group of 100 Americans, I mean, mathematically, about 50 of them will say they love him, 50% will say they hate him. Maybe not the exact math. Maybe there's a couple in the middle who are ambivalent, but for the most part, either you love him or you hate him. It's so fascinating that a man who is so polarizing and is dealing with these criminal charges, these legitimate charges of, showing classified documents, of being involved with RICO, with, potential, with defamation, with business dealings, it really hasn't hurt his presidential case. He is dominating the Republican primary nominees. You could also maybe talk about how maybe the actual other candidates are very weak, which I know Anthony and Jorge did talk about, or maybe they also weren't ready. But it's fascinating how much he has dominated. He is dominating right now. Essentially, we already know who's going to be the president before the Super Tuesday, which wasn't even the case when he was running in 2016. That is, I think, the most fascinating thing about this.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of the magic of a democracy, I guess, for better, for worse, depending on where you're coming from. is that the people are going to choose, and that the ultimate court is the people's court. You have juries, and juries will say whether or not Trump is guilty or innocent of what he's being charged with. But in some sense, the larger court is the will of the people who can elect him, whether he's convicted or not. And just to send it to break after this, just a little bit of this of what's going on out there. It's 9:00. A number of additional states have closed. The rest of Texas closed. Colorado closed. Maybe another probably the third strongest state for Haley. Minnesota's closed, and a number of additional primaries were called. Virginia, Texas, Arkansas, Massachusetts, and Alabama. Most of those, Trump is up 50 or more. Now, in some of them, Virginia, Trump took it by 28, Massachusetts, 26. Maine and Arkansas, he's just a little bit below 50. Alabama, plus 64.
Yeah, I mean, it's a flat out boat race. And it's also, I think another thing, and this is something that we will delve definitely more into when we talk about Joe Biden's presidency, because as much as we want this show and the conversation to be about the Republican primary and the Republican candidates, I think this is also a reflection on Joe Biden to a lesser extent, because let's go to your hypothetical universe once again. Joe Biden has not been, to be as objective as possible, he has not been the greatest president.
Right.
There are a lot of issues that have been wrong, that have gone wrong, international or domestically, internationally, economically, what have you. I think even with the exception of the strongest Joe Biden supporters, I think that is a statement let's say 90% of Americans agree on.
Ryan, his approval rating's in the 30s.
His approval rating's in the 30s. Yes, it is very historically low. It's historically low. I think also the reason why Trump, and it's crazy because during all this, Trump's approval rating and his popularity has kind of maybe not reached the heights of what it was maybe 2016, but it's higher than it was in 2020. It's back and forth between him and Joe Biden, and he's higher in some states than Joe Biden, but it's very close. I think this just has to play a factor because, and maybe if you're going to your universe of whether or not he runs, let's say it's a candidate, or let's say if it was a candidate that was a very high approval rating, it was a very strong likely chance of him or her winning the winning once again. So let's say it was like Obama in 2012. I know he had some popularity, but he basically won pretty convincingly against Mitt Romney. Do you think he also runs? Then he's like, I got to deal with these court cases. The likelihood of me winning is very low. I'm very polarizing in and of itself. The person who I'm running against, very high approval rating. I'm going to focus on trying to save myself and not be in prison the day I die.
Biden. For Biden.
No, I'm saying for Trump. Sorry. I'm sorry.
For Trump.
I'm saying the reason why Donald Trump is still historically is still popular despite kind of the historical, the cases against him.
Sure.
But because of how bad Joe Biden has been, or how his disapproval rating, you said it's in the 30s. I'm wondering, this is a hypothetical I'll pose out to you maybe before we send to a break. If Joe Biden was, a candidate that had strong approval ratings, was going into this election, let's say in the 70s, like some of these other presidents we've seen in the past, do you think he runs because part of the reason why we're saying he's running is to pardon himself? Do you think if the odds were so stacked against him, he would just want to focus on trying to, I don't want to say legally get out of these cases because pardoning is part of our political system, it's part of our law system. But he's like, I'm going to try focus on winning these cases and focus on beating these cases myself because I know I can't do it by winning the presidency.
It's interesting to think about. And this is one of those things that the historians are going to write about, is if wars didn't start, if Russia didn't invade Ukraine, if Hamas didn't attack Israel, if international shipping wasn't disrupted, if inflation wasn't so high, would Trump even try? I think yes. I don't think Trump believes the numbers. I I think if you tell Trump these are the odds you're going to win, he's going to pull a Han Solo and say, never tell me the odds, kid.
I mean, that's what they told him in 2016.
And look what happened.
Yeah. So,
then look at what happened in 2020. They told him the odds in 2020.
Yeah.
And he didn't believe he lost. I don't think he does data.
He doesn't, dude. I mean, he could be an old school guy, you know. He is in his 70s. I just thought it'd be very interesting because I think part of the reason why the Trump kind of polling is so fascinating is because the polarization we're seeing from the other side.
Certainly. Let's cue up a couple of songs. But what we got next, we're going to go exactly into what Ryan was just talking about. We're going to go into the pros and the cons of Biden's presidency. What do our analysts think of how he did? What was he strong on? What was he weak on? Were things that happened that people might blame him for, the wars, were they his fault? All of these topics and more are going to be discussed by our very own Liam Harding and Joe Morales, who are in studio ready to roll. You're listening to Super Tuesday coverage on 89.5 FM WSOU. Keep it locked.
WSOU's election coverage of Super Tuesday in 2024 rolls on here on 89.5 WSOU. Segment number 4. Joe Morales and Liam Harding. The pros and cons of the Biden presidency. The biggest discussion point, at least in my opinion, the biggest discussion point of the night. Because Super Tuesday to me, Liam, is the biggest day in an election year aside from the actual election. So when voters in most of the states around the country are heading out to the polls, they are considering a bunch of factors. What has the president done for me, my family, the country? And what can the next president, or I shouldn't say next president, what could the alternative provide for me, my family, and the country? All these things are considered, and it starts here with the pros and cons of the Biden presidency. And as you heard in the last segment, the approval rating for Joe Biden at 34% right now, which is lower than what it was under Trump. It was low. It was a little higher than the end of the Obama presidency. And Liam, just the overall feelings of Americans right now is that the country is not heading in the right direction. But a chance to change the tides with Super Tuesday and the election in November coming up here, Liam.
Oh, no, Joe, you said a lot of things I definitely agree on, especially in terms of what Super Tuesday is and how it's looking at how the current president is doing and what he has done negatively and positively for myself, my family, my common interests, and then looking at these, other nominees from both sides, whether it's Democratic, Republican, Independent, and see what these new characters or new politicians in this realm can do for myself, and the pros and cons list. So that's what I think Super Tuesday is. And as you said, and as Ryan and Dovid said before about Joe Biden's approval, going on right now, it's actually in his third year right now. It's the lowest of any president since Jimmy Carter.
Wow.
So it's been a while. It's been the lowest it has been in a couple of years.
Well,
so.
Almost 50 years since the Carter presidency were going on. That's remarkable, Liam. But before we get into anything with President Biden's tenure, Texas, Massachusetts, and Colorado going to Donald Trump right now. The only state that Nikki Haley appears to have a case in right now is Vermont, and then later on we'll get some info on Massachusetts. That's her other, I guess you can call it strong suit, I guess you could say, on the Nikki Haley trail. Hasn't been a good run for Nikki Haley. Still trying to get her feet wet in the presidential primaries. But, Liam, let's shift things over to President Biden. Now, it's been a pretty eventful last couple of years with President Biden. And it started off with the COVID years and taking over after Trump, and the inflation was a bit higher than normal. People were noticing their groceries, their gas prices going up, and that could be because of a myriad of factors when it comes to energy and other things around the country. But that was what Americans noticed. Now, a lot of people don't care why it's happening. They just notice it is happening. So for the common American, seeing the price of milk, the price of eggs, the price of the gasoline go up, it's a bit of a turnoff for Americans, Liam. And trying to navigate that and getting that fixed was a big point for Biden. It's a big running point for Donald Trump here. It has not been a good 3 years for the economy and for inflation itself, Liam.
No, you said it really well, Joe. Especially looking at like milk. I know, especially talking to people I know, that milk has, price of milk, price of just necessities you need to live and have, the bare necessities, the needs to have a good life here, have just gone up dramatically.
Right.
Under this administration, you could say it has failed, based on what Joe Biden has said during his whole campaign, during his election, and ensuing the couple of years. It actually turns out that Americans are spending $11,400 more annually to buy the basic necessities, food, water, all that sort of stuff, compared to that before the Biden administration. So again, it's just crazy to see how these numbers are just, adding up and rattling, keep increasing as his tenure goes on as president.
And it's interesting for people who are barely making ends meet and maybe don't make enough money to feel comfortable spending that much more money in necessities with a Biden presidency right now, Liam. When you talk about things like that, it's a scary feeling for Americans who maybe don't know if they can afford next week's groceries, or maybe don't know how they're getting to work next week if the gas is too high. So navigating that has been a struggle for Americans over the last 3 years, and the solutions from President Biden, yes, he's tried, but we're starting to see it sort of go down right now, Liam. It's heading in the right direction, but it's still much higher than where it was compared to a couple of years ago. Now, yes, COVID did play a factor in that. We saw grocery prices skyrocket during COVID a little bit just because of, that's a global pandemic. I feel like that's a very specific and extreme circumstance to compare it to. But you can get gas, at least in my area, for under $2 a gallon. And that's a big deal, at least for me, Liam. That one hit close to home because I was a new driver during that time, Liam. And up near $4 a gallon for me was just... It really, quite frankly, wasn't doable, Liam. I don't know about you, but I was not enjoying paying $4 a gallon. But I was happy to see it start going down once you started seeing some new policies put in place, Liam. But the American who was trying to get to work had to resort to a public transportation, had to conserve their gas miles. Say, maybe I'm not going to point A this week. I have to save up to get to work next week. But the policies put in place, Liam, have helped. It's still not where it should be, though.
No, it has helped in a lot of areas, but just looking at the broader scheme of it, when President Biden took office, inflation was just at 1.4%, not horrible at all, but since then it has risen by 17.2% to about that would be 18.6% overall. And just again, the basic necessities that we keep talking about, that for a lot of our parents, the older generations, people that didn't really have to think about how much milk was, bread, all that. And now they have to take a look at every explicit thing and be like, I don't know, maybe we won't do bread this week. Maybe we won't get this milk. Maybe we'll go with a cheaper variant of something. Or as you were saying, Joe, like, people how to conserve gas. Maybe we won't go drive to work today. Maybe I'll ride a bike or take public transit.
Right.
And especially during the pandemic, that was a very scary thing for people, because with the not really knowing how the spread of COVID was working in the early parts of it, people were hesitant to take those public transit. So it kind of was like leaving people at a crossroads. And while we keep kind of talking about how there have been inflation by President Biden during this time hasn't been up to par. Right here I'm reading on the GOP.gov website that crackers, bread, and cracker products were up 7.7%.
Wow.
Inflation. But, there have been some good things that, kind of you can see why this inflation is going on. For example, $15 minimum wage for federal workers and contractors has been up, which maybe not for every American, but that definitely has helped some people who have been going around with all this, worrying about what they're going to buy, and like all that. And then also he's done a lot with healthcare, and that's kind of balanced it out, that now Medicare and all these other companies are allowing the prices of some highly, highly pricey medications, especially like insulin, to be charged and sold for as low as $30-$35. So because of all these ways of trying to help out those people that have always been almost like left out by other people, by the other administrations, whether it be Donald Trump or Barack Obama or all these other presidents the past couple of years, he's trying to make it more affordable for them to get their basic necessities. So it's kind of like you got to give to take. You got to raise a little bit of money for inflation just so these people can have the basic necessities to live. Because it doesn't matter how much a jar of jam is or a loaf of bread is for these people if they can't get their insulin because it's $200.
Joe Morales and Liam Harding here with you on WSOU's election coverage. We're going to get to Biden's immigration policies. We're going to get to the wars that are stemming in Ukraine and in Israel. But quickly, we have to mention, because this was a big part of Biden's presidency, Liam, as he navigated out of the COVID pandemic. That was a big part of it. And we are, for the most part, out of the clear right now, Liam. And it took some time to get out of it. But it was under Biden that the country moved out of that state of emergency to where now, COVID's not on the mind of the average American. It's still an issue for some people, but it is out of the mind of the American people. And now it's seen as a regular old viral infection. So now moving out of this era of American history is a good thing, and that was one thing that Biden used to get out of it. But let's move over to immigration. Let's move over to proxy. Liam, I'm going to let you choose here. What do you want to start with first? I'm going to let you choose here.
I'm going with immigration.
You want to go immigration first? Okay. So there have been some issues with immigration, to say the least, Liam, at the southern border of the United States. States like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona have struggled with handling illegal immigrants coming over the border, and they've, since Greg Abbott in Texas wrote up a couple of plans to send the immigrants out of the state to other states that were willing to accept them, like New York, and New York City was a big hub for them. California was a big hub for illegal immigrants, and that did lead to a bit of a spike in crime, Liam. You see in the news every once in a while where illegal immigrants do commit crimes against American citizens, and it's like, well, are they supposed to be here in the first place? It's a big issue around the country here, Liam. But trying to secure the southern border has been a big issue for President Biden, something that he hasn't been able to accomplish. Now, under Trump, the southern border was a main running point for Donald Trump. That was one of the first things he talked about on that escalator ride down in Trump Tower that one day in 2015. But since then, the border project has been stalled. It doesn't seem to be addressed by the current regime, and it's turned into a really big problem, specifically for these big cities, Liam.
Yeah, as you were saying, Joe, about these illegal immigrants coming into these bigger states and these cities and these states like New York City, out there in California, there's a plethora of cities, you have San Francisco, Los Angeles, where all these, hubs that are meccas in the world, they're seeing a rise of the illegal immigrants. And before we got on, I was talking to Dovid, and first thing we thought of was more recently, a few weeks ago, there was I think it was like 12 or 14 illegal immigrants who attacked the NYPD officer up there in New York, and that was just a big thing. I know I always was covering it on my shifts for news here at the station. So again, it's been a very, very big problem, and we talk about the southern border, and that is obviously the crux of it all. Over 7.2 million illegal crossings have occurred there, but a total of 8.7 million nationwide. So that means you're getting 1.5 from other areas, whether it be from up north into Canada up there, and then somehow coming in through different ports, because I know that's also another thing where people sneak in through some ports and the boats out there. So again, it's something that needs to be addressed, because when you total up the 7.2 million illegals who have crossed in from the southern border, they are greater than the populations of 36 states.
Right.
And, some of these states make sense, like obviously more than Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, like stuff like that. But then you look and it's like, well, there's more of them than people that are from Nevada, Delaware, Connecticut. Some of these bigger states, especially in our area where we think there's, a decent bit more people than, that. And 7.2 million illegal people coming in, outnumbering 36 states, is just mind-boggling to me.
And Liam, it's become an issue for states like New York and cities like New York specifically, like you were talking about. But when illegal aliens are given the benefits that some Americans lack having right now, like immigrants receiving health care and receiving benefits from the government. It doesn't sit well with Americans when you have a large population of homeless veterans, a large population of homeless people to begin with. You walk around New York City, it's a glaring issue. You walk around California, it's a glaring issue. The cities of America are struggling right now, and with resources going towards them, it doesn't sit well with some Americans, Liam. Now, you could say that they need to be housed, yes. They need a place to stay, yes. But I still don't believe that Americans are comfortable with watching their money be put into programs like this when other Americans, people who have been here for a while and people who have served the country, still struggle with issues like this, Liam.
Yeah, you said it right there that, yes, obviously these illegal immigrants can't be just left out on the streets. They can't just be homeless. But at the same time, a lot of Americans it doesn't sit well with them that the fact that some of these, brave men and women who, serve the country in wars and have seen a lot of, horrific things in their lives are dealing with not getting those same necessities that these illegal immigrants are getting, especially the fact that, there's a lot of homeless in New York City. And,
right.
I've actually done some charity out there talking to them, and a lot of them were former, military service officers. Men and women who served valiantly, and I know my family, that's something that is very near and dear to our hearts, is the military. They've all served in the military, and just seeing that, I know it definitely doesn't sit well, and it's something that should be addressed in both ways, because again, illegal immigrants can't just be left with nothing. Something has to be done to keep them housing and keep them off the streets, while at the same time something also has to be done for these men and women who also need to be kept off the streets.
And Liam, it's a tough situation because you want to take care of everybody. You want to be able to lend the helping hand and support humans as a whole. But when it's American citizens, and that is the priority I feel like Republicans, for the most part, feel that the priority should be with the American people, while the Democrats lean towards letting or supporting everyone and supporting the illegal immigrants as long as they are in the country and afford them opportunities here. But Republicans and Donald Trump is running on a platform of trying to clean up this mess that these cities have had, Liam. And you don't see it in a state like Florida. You don't see it in a state like Texas. They are very against bringing in illegal immigrants and supporting them and finding housing for them and supporting them with food and health insurance. Especially like we were talking about, Liam, when other things like that are happening with the American people themselves, when people in this country are already struggling with things like that. Before we move over to the proxy wars, Liam, anything else you want to add on the immigration?
It's again, I'm looking at information from the GOP.gov, and it says that there was 340 individuals whose names appeared on terrorist watch list who stopped at the southern border, and also reading this article, that it turns out that President Biden never spoke with the Border Patrol chief during 2 years that he held the position. The Border Patrol chief at the time was Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz, and he said that he only talked to President Biden once and never heard from Vice President Harris. So that's a very big issue, especially when you find out 7.2 million illegal immigrants as a whole have been trying to cross. They had 1.8 million that just got away from Border Patrol authorities. But again, 340 people whose names appeared on terrorist watch lists. That's something that's big, because we, as society, especially in our area, there've been a lot of attacks, Boston, 9/11, all these things, Boston Marathon, all this, and it's something very important to the identity of what America is. And it's like, we don't like having domestic terrorism happen on our no one does, but especially you don't want it in this area. And the fact that 340 individuals tried coming in, and they were stopped, but because of how lenient and lackadaisical it is down there sometimes with this administration, it's something that as a citizen, that kind of scares me, because that's 340 that were seen, that were 340 that were caught, but there's 1.8 million people that got away. How many of those people would be on these watch lists?
Joe Morales and Liam Harding once again taking you through the next couple minutes on 89.5 FM's Super Tuesday coverage of the Republican primaries and the Democratic primaries, and getting you set for the general election. And Liam, one last thing on immigration. It's just it's one thing that this administration has turned a blind eye to, and it's something that Trump and it's something that Republicans are going to run heavily on as we approach November. So we have a couple more minutes left here, Liam. Let's shift things over to do you want to call them proxy wars? Do you want to call them indirect wars? There are two controversial wars going on overseas right now, one between Israel and Palestine, one between Ukraine and Russia. And the Ukraine and Russia one's a bit older, so let's start with that, Liam. It is a war that's been going on for about 2 years now, with no end in sight. It started a couple years ago, and it's been funded by a little bit. It's been funded by Americans for the most part. The money, as you see on the news, the money being voted on in Congress to send over to Ukraine. Now, again, these are two controversial wars, so when it comes to that, Liam, it's a very divisive subject of the American people. So when it comes to whether the money should be sent overseas, or again, this is connected to immigration, if you want to use it to help the existing problems that you have in this country, and there are plenty of them, if you want to use it here, then the money cannot go overseas to support a war that the United States has no point fighting in, Liam.
Yeah, during research for this whole thing, it was at this moment I realized I would never want to be president of the United States. There are a lot of tough decisions.
You got that right, Liam.
I don't think many of us in the studio would want that job.
It's much easier to see you talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Most, you know what I mean?
Especially when it comes to this, because it's easier for us, as you said, Joe, for us to talk about what we would do. But it's kind of hard, especially being humanitarianism that's big in America, and just being like good people. We see how in the history of this country, how they've gone on to help other countries who have been in need, whether it be in wars like this or, with the Red Cross and all these natural disasters, helping out in Haiti when the earthquake happened there, I think in 2008, many years ago, 2011 with Japan and the tsunami. But again, it's a tough place to be in because, you want to help your ally out, and Ukraine is an ally with the U.S., especially in this situation against Russia. But at the same time, some of that money should not be sent. As much of the money that's being sent over, not all of it should be. It should be, equally dispersed, because the numbers that are going out to Ukraine are mind-boggling. And at the frequency that I, turn on Twitter or Instagram or the news on anything, and it's just like, oh yeah, more money's being sent over, and it's at like a very high rate. It's like, well, where is this money coming from? Because I keep seeing everything go up in inflation. So again, it's something that should be addressed, especially when there's all these problems, as you said, Joe, that are, ingrained in what America is. Right.
It's funny how this all ties together. When you go back to immigration, when you go back to inflation, you could stem this all to some of these wars that are going on overseas. And if you look at it, like, there are so many problems in this country right now, and we're going to fund a war in Ukraine, or we're going to fund a war in the Middle East. Liam, again, it doesn't sit well with Americans. It's not just a little bit of money that's going over. This is billions of dollars going over to fight these wars right now, Liam. It doesn't sit well with Americans, like I said. And the other one, Israel and Palestine, that one a little more controversial than the others, but also, in my opinion, a war that the United States, and the majority of most Americans, to be fair, a war the United States really does not need to get involved with, and a war the United States does not need to be funneling money over to, Liam. And the majority of Americans support that.
Yeah, it definitely is a very controversial war that is going on out there with Palestine and Israel. But as you said, Joe, it is something that many Americans don't believe should be, funded by America. And that's something that I agree with, because just going back to we have a lot of problems here in America, and you want to fix those, and you don't want the cracks to, become larger and bigger. And it's kind of easy to see that with funding a war in the Middle East, especially when you see that in other parts of the Middle East that they've taken troops out of. And, over 1,000 Americans were abandoned when they withdrew troops from Afghanistan earlier during this term, and $7 billion worth of U.S. military equipment was left behind. So $7 billion, may not seem like a lot to, the government, but it is a lot in reality. And the fact that they were just going to leave that there and they're still funneling money to Ukraine and Palestine and Israel is just something that should not be happening.
Well, those are some divisive issues. Liam, thank you for joining me, and it's been a fun little segment we've had here on 89.5's Super Tuesday coverage. What's not controversial? Exodus. We'll take a quick break with Persona Non Grata by Exodus. When we come back, more coverage from our analysts here on 89.5 WSOU.
welcome back to this broadcast of our Super Tuesday election night coverage. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Ryan Henry, joined alongside Jorge Rivera. You're listening to WSOU FM South Orange, New Jersey. Now, we're going to discuss about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., son of Bobby Kennedy and nephew of John Kennedy, two famous, infamous American politicians of the 20th century. But before we do that, there is something I do want to mention. So, while the big attention right now is going on for these primaries and these caucuses is about the Republican candidate and who is going to represent the Republican Party in November, the Democratic candidates are still up in their own right. They still have to run, do the whole thing. Obviously, usually the incumbent wins, but not in this case. In American Samoa, a territory of the United States, Jason Palmer actually took home victory. Most infamously, a couple days ago, became the first candidate to release an AI-powered version of himself called Palmer AI. It's an interactive experience that transcends traditional campaign engagement. This is from PR Newswire. It's not uncharted territory, especially in American Samoa, because, as our lovely Dovid Holtzman pointed out as well, Mike Bloomberg won American Samoa in 2020 when Trump was the incumbent. But what I like to say, Jorge, it's something you just keep in the memory bank. So I don't know if you have any thoughts. We can talk about Robert Kennedy, but I wanted to bring it up because it was something interesting to talk about. Also, Donald Trump has won the state of Minnesota as well.
An AI-powered, I find that interesting. It's definitely something new age, not something we've seen yet. And I'm sure something we'll see in the years to come.
Yeah, it definitely will be interesting. A little bit about Jason Palmer before we get in. Served in executive positions at Microsoft, the Bill Gates Foundation, New Market Ventures. So involved in the tech and entrepreneurial world. Obviously has a lot of Bill Gates influence by those the two former companies I mentioned. But let's talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a former Democrat turned independent in October. Although the reason why we decided to make an entire segment, because every year every election cycle there are third party candidates. You have Jill Stein, Gary Johnson. Usually they if they're lucky they'll get like a couple percentage of votes, but more often than not they're kind of laid aside. America has traditionally been a two-party system. You know, a third-party candidate really hasn't impacted the election cycle legitimately since Ross Perot in 1992, when George Bush Sr., the father, and Bill Clinton ran. He had 22% of the votes. Recent polls are showing that there's a couple of different polls you're seeing. New York Times and Siena had a poll where he was up to 25% in some states. Quinnipiac poll had him at 22%. An NPR, PBS, Marist poll had him at around 16%. So he's polling at around 15 to 25%. It's not indicative of what happened in the election. That can change. But he's a big-time player, one, because of, obviously, his name and legacy being attached to former President John F. Kennedy, former Senator Bobby Kennedy, who was also probably going to be a president in his own right before he got assassinated. And he also has got, obviously has had a big traction as an independent. So the first thing I want to kick back to you. So we have, before we kind of break down him as Kennedy as a whole, is R.F. Kennedy Jr. a legitimate third-party candidate that could disrupt the election cycle?
Well, it's a very good question, and before anything, I want to thank you. I'm very happy to be discussing RFK, because I find RFK Jr., son of RFK, he seems to be a very interesting individual because, of course, as you mentioned, there's many independent candidates who have, in their own right, made a splash in the political scene. But for the most part, it's been a two-party system. You have the Democrats and the Republicans. And so RFK Jr., what he's doing is sort of challenging the space in ways that many independents have tried to do in the past. And as in 1992, Ross Perot was doing when he lost to Bill Clinton. And so, A few other polls that I did want to mention. I see January 2024 was an Economist poll. He tied in lowest unfavorability, tying with Nikki Haley at 34%, and then a 45% very or somewhat favorable opinion voters are holding of RFK Jr. And then a Gallup favorability poll, RFK holding the highest favorability at 52%, Trump trailing behind at 42%, Biden at 41%, and Nikki Haley at 33%. So I think the numbers are definitely showing you something there, which is that he's tapping into a voter base that is interested, at least in the things he has to say. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of the buzzwords, I would call them, thrown around on media articles. You know, people have called him a conspiracy theorist, which is something to investigate on its own. And but just to say, one thing that I do want to touch on, which is something that I find very interesting, is you might have noticed in the last 5 years, podcasting has become a very, very big deal. So what I did was I compiled a short list here of 6 different podcasts that he's gone on, mainly from June of last year to about September. So Joe Rogan, 10 million views in June of 2023. Bill Maher, 2 million views also in June. July 2023, Lex Friedman, 7 million views. 2 million views with Piers Morgan, 13 million views with Tucker Carlson, and 1 million views with Theo Von. And so I have not personally seen Joe Biden or Trump do the same amount of rounds as you've seen RFK Jr. doing. And I think what that's enabling is for him to tap into a younger voter base. It's the people who are on social media natively. It's people our age. And they're seeing a lot of what he has to say in longer form. So what you can't do in cable news is, sit down, you get interrupted by the commercials. But in a format like Joe Rogan, he got to sit down in a 3-hour format and sort of speak his mind. So I don't know if there's anything you want to touch on in terms of that and sort of what he's been able to achieve on the communication side of his campaign.
Yeah, he definitely has been going unorthodox in his campaign stream. I think this is actually helping him out, like you said, because it helps out in a couple of ways. One, he's tapping into that market base, like you said. He's tapping into that younger market base. The people like, Joe Rogan, Theo Von. I bet you, if I asked my mom if she knew who Theo Von was, no offense to my lovely mother, Katie Henry, she probably does not know who Theo Von is. But I'm not someone who watches all of his podcasts and is a devout Theo Von fan, but I've seen a bunch of his clips on TikTok and Instagram. I know in January he was a part of the ESPN College Game Day preview show. That's how much of the pull he's getting even now in the mainstream media. And obviously Joe Rogan is kind of in his own stratosphere as a podcasting host. He's in the UFC sphere as well. So he's tapping into that market. But also something else he does. Not only is he attracting the younger viewers, but let's say he's tapping that viewer base, but he's also doing something very interesting. So if you're someone, you're going out to the vote in 2024, and you aren't the most educated or caught up individual, which I don't want to throw rough generalizations out there, but a lot of times that is what's happening. Maybe for the presidential election, you get more informed viewers, but there are a decent amount of viewers who maybe know a decent amount of voters who know surface level. You throw RFK Jr. on a Theo Von and Joe Rogan podcast, you're not getting maybe the full picture because obviously it's very sided towards himself.
Of course. But
you're getting a lot of what he is about. You're getting like details on his policies, some of his thoughts, maybe talking about, you said he was the conspiracy theories that are coming out in his anti-vax stance. You're getting maybe a more detailed explanation, and you're not getting bogged down by 20 different articles on various political websites. You're consuming it in one space. You can listen to it kind of at your own pace. And so you're learning more about him and his policies, and you're like, oh, I saw him on Theo Von and Joe Rogan. Okay, I kind of understand what he's saying now. So it's kind of working twofold.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's giving the viewers and listeners the opportunity to learn for themselves. While a media organization might put things a spin on them, you want to hear it from themselves, from the candidate themselves. And even though, it's going to have a bias, of course. It's you put anybody on a podcast, they're going to talk about themselves. They're going to put themselves in a positive light. I mean, that's undeniable. But it's giving you, the listener, the opportunity to decide for yourself, and I think that's the most powerful thing. The other thing I wanted to mention was that I'm not sure if you saw the Super Bowl, but there was an ad there. I don't know if you wanted to cover that. I'll just give you a few stats here. So it was $7 million to air. Kennedy had no involvement in the production of the ad, so there was a little bit of backlash. We could talk about that in a minute. But it did, it was shown in front of an estimated 100 million people, Americans who were tuning in for the Super Bowl. It was 30 seconds long, and then it was created by the Super PAC American Values 2024. So basically, what his family was saying was that it was, without reason, sort of copying the ad style of his late uncle, John F. Kennedy. And it was interesting because, well, you look at it, and yeah, it's an exact representation of the old ad. If you were to actually Google it, it's frame by frame, almost identical, except with photos of him as opposed to his uncle. And so I wrote down a little blurb here, which is the response. He did respond to the backlash he was getting on Twitter or X. And here's the quote. It says, the ad was created and aired by the American Values Super PAC without any involvement or approval from my campaign, and FEC rules prohibit Super PACs from consulting with me or my staff. So is there anything else you wanted to add there?
No, yeah. I will say, so I did, like many Americans, I did watch Super Bowl, and I saw that ad. I didn't originally pick up on it. Actually, it was my roommate who I think picked up on it and told me, because it looked very retro, but I was like, I didn't exactly know like what the vibe was, and I remember he said that like, oh yeah, it's from John F. Kennedy's campaign. I'm like, okay, so it makes a lot more sense. But yeah, it's a good. Now, like you said, he had no direct involvement or say,
right,
or at least that we know of. We don't know behind closed doors what's going on, but he directly said he has no involvement. It's from the American Values Super PAC, and I want to talk about that because another thing that RFK Jr. has going for him that many independent candidates, well, really no independent candidate has had before him because of the rise of super PACs and, funding into presidential campaigns over the past, decade or so, is he has that major funding. He, like you said, American Values is the super PAC that's funding him. They announced last week that he's actually gathered enough signatures to qualify Kennedy for appearances on the November ballot in Arizona and Georgia. Although, I will say this, there has been some backlash, especially from the DNC, who are very much, fear. I don't know, fear. They're hostile towards the Kennedys. And there's another point I want to talk about after I talk about this. So they filed a complaint on Monday that American Values Committee failed to properly disclose $10 million in loans and $9.65 million in loan repayments to Gavin Day Becker in violation of federal law. Day Becker is a private secretary, security executive, and the loan funding may have led the public to believe the organization had more funding than it actually has. That's what the DNC is claiming. They also claimed alleged in February 9th that the Kennedy campaign was running an illegal ballot access scheme. So, I want to pose this question. Well, I want to talk this about you.
Sure.
The big thing that RFK has going for him that no other independent has ever had is this big-time funding. He's a Kennedy, so I assume he has money to his name, but also he has the backing of a legitimate super PAC, which no other third party has ever had.
In terms of funding, I have really nothing else to add in particular, I'll just say. But I if you want to comment after. But what I'd say is it's an interesting position for him to be in, just because he is an independent. So you have enemies on both sides of the political aisle. You have a lot of enemies, in fact, more than either Trump or Biden, I would actually begin to think. And so I would like to see sort of how is the money being allocated. I would imagine, we saw $7 million to air a 30-second ad. Did it pay off? How many people who saw the ad are really convinced? I'm not sure how many minds were changed. And I'm not really sure who it was targeted towards, because, of course, it could be targeted to people who are registered as a Democrat, Independent, or Republican. So I suppose in terms of funding, if there's anything else you'd like to add, but I also, after you've commented, would like to talk about Secret Service. That's a big topic, Secret Service and the lack thereof.
Yes, I did, because I was also that. And you mentioned that RFK has staunch opposition from either side. It's very funny because Donald Trump says that Kennedy is a closeted liberal, and Joe Biden says he's a closeted conservative, which is like, they're basically just saying the same thing. But I do think it's interesting because the polls are showing that he's pulling more voters away from Trump, but it seems like the Democratic Party is the one who fears him more. I mean, obviously he was registered as a Democrat. You have the DNC filing some complaints against the super PAC. We'll see how those go. But the point you were referring to is RF Kennedy Jr. right now has no Secret Service, which, when you're thinking about it, why doesn't he have Secret Service? But it is essentially a gentleman's agreement that every opposing candidate will get Secret Service provided them by the incumbent president. So when Donald Trump was running in 2016, President Obama gave it to him. When Joe Biden was running in 2020, Donald Trump provided him Secret Service. In 2024, talking about how much political polarization, Joe Biden is still providing Secret Service to Donald Trump. He is not providing service to Robert F. Kennedy. Do you think... Now, there are two main arguments that you could say this. A, Joe Biden doesn't believe... He's not a technical legitimate candidate, so he doesn't qualify. Or does he fear RFK Jr. so much as a political opponent, and he thinks he'll take so much away from his own, voters, that he's trying to drain him of as many funds as possible so he doesn't make it to November, or he makes it to November limping, essentially?
I could definitely see those concerns. I mean, if you think about the cost to have private security detail with you at all times, events, even if you're just home, I think having that maintenance cost for his campaign must be a tremendous baggage. And I think it could be strategic, but it could also just be a mere coincidence. And maybe there are no coincidences, but I just want to touch upon some details first regarding the whole Secret Service aspect here. So the Department of Homeland Security works together with the Congressional Advisory Committee to determine whether or not they're eligible. If we look at history, we see Trump actually had Secret Service far before Super Tuesday. So, we have to judge based on a number of different factors, whether it's polling, fundraising, perceived threat levels to said candidate. And I mean, it's a Kennedy. I think there's no other name in politics other than a Kennedy that you could really think of having the highest amount of,
he even says himself.
Yeah, exactly. Every podcast he goes on, he says, I understand the risk, and it's something that he's worth fighting. He says it's worth fighting for, and so Associated Press was writing that quote, a vast majority of primary candidates do not receive protection. There are exceptions, like I just mentioned, Donald Trump, but there are security concerns. In the past, September of 2023 last year, an armed man entered a campaign event of his, and then later, a month later, twice in one day, a man who was also armed entered his LA residence. Again, it's shocking that it's twice in one day. I couldn't even imagine, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. I don't know what the whole case there was. But there's definitely a case to be made. The fact that he does need Secret Service, and it's not one time that he had requested Secret Service. I believe it's 3 or more times at this point. So I don't know if there's anything you want to comment there. I find it so fascinating.
I find it fascinating as well. I also think, I don't entirely blame him, but the fact that he's not getting Secret Service, and I don't want to put the tin hat on, but it's also very, like you said, there may not be any coincidences. The one guy who's not getting Secret Service also happens to be the father of a very infamous political candidate who got assassinated, and is the nephew of another.
and during his campaign, mind you, RFK, the father, was assassinated at exactly around this point during his campaign, which is just something to note.
So, I obviously don't. Well, I obviously wouldn't hope that that's the intention, but you have to, you can't be, you cannot be concerned if you're RFK. But I want to talk about more of. I want to switch topics just a little bit.
Sure.
When you mentioned, what was the stat you said that he was ahead of, or He was second to Nikki Haley, or ahead of Nikki Haley. I wanted to get the exact wordage because as a transition.
So we're talking about favorability.
Favorability.
Right.
That's. I wanted to find the right word.
Yes.
Favorability.
Favorability.
So, when you're talking about Donald Trump, Joe Biden, I mentioned this during my Donald Trump, or when I was talking about the criminal trials, and they mentioned on the last topic as well. We have not been at a more dire situation where you either love or you either hate the candidate or you hate both candidates at the same time. There's many, Joe Biden's approval rating right now is in the 30s, which is historically low for a president. I forget who said it was like the lowest for a president entering his third year, which is historically low. RFK has something to offer for both sides. Do you think his viability? Do you think he actually serves? Could he actually cause a ripple effect and serve as a true alternative? Because so many people saw what happened in 2016, saw what happened in the COVID pandemic. They're like, nope, don't want that. They're seeing right now, U.S. is entering 2 proxy wars. They may or may not should be involved in. The economy is at an all-time low. They're like, I don't want that either. Also, both of them are in their 80s. That's a concern. There's obviously the Joe Biden drama recently controversy recently where he wouldn't take a cognitive test. And look, it's a real threat because you're not only voting for Donald Trump and Joe Biden at their current ages. You're getting them for Joe Biden will be 85 by the time he has done his by the time 2024 happens, and Donald Trump will be 81.
They're late in their age, as we can see. Cognitively, we can comment, but I think what I would like to talk about here is what we're seeing in terms of policy. I mean, you mentioned earlier, whose votes is he going to be, siphoning? And you said Trump. I'd be curious to hear your opinion on why, but I also have a few points on actual policy itself. He aligns more with Trump on immigration, on the Ukraine war. A lot of his rhetoric is anti-establishment. We see in the medical side of things as well, but also the 3-letter agencies. He's name-dropped the CIA as one example. But then again, the media as well. He talks a lot of anti-establishment rhetoric, and I think that's appealing to a lot of Republican voters, but also I would say anybody on both sides, because you have people who are weary of government on both sides of the political aisle. One other thing that I made a note of I found very interesting. This was a tweet that he made the other day, RFK Jr., saying that he plans to repeal the Patriot Act. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, which is an act essentially that expanded government surveillance in order to counter terrorism that followed 9/11. And so this is something that he seeks to repeal if he were to be elected. But these are some of the points with Trump. I would say that in terms of aligning with Biden in policy, more environmentalism. And I just want to add a quick anecdote. So I heard a little bit of the Joe Rogan podcast and a little bit of his background, which I found to be pretty interesting. He was basically, a lot of his early career had to do with litigating against corporations that were polluting the environment in many different places. He worked on the Hudson River because there was one point where one of his personal stories, if I can recall, he was talking about how Ford had a plant that was situated on the Hudson River, and they would be, manufacturing their cars, and there'd be runoff, paint running into the Hudson. And he said, the Hudson, each and every day is a different color because of all the chemicals that are running in it. Mm-hmm. And so he helped in the cleanup program for this, cleaning up the Hudson, and over many, many years. Now I'm sure you go to Hoboken, you're like, wow, this is beautiful. It's like clear blue, maybe not clear blue waters. Yeah. It's more like green. Yeah. But it's better than what it was.
You can maybe see like 4 feet down.
Yeah, like there's no animals there. Nothing is swimming in those waters. No. But that's like the background of his environmentalism, and he does have those climate change concerns. Aligns with Biden on abortion, access to affordable health care, and aid for Israel as well. So I don't know. I think I'd like to hear, why do you think RFK Jr. would siphon more votes from Trump compared to Biden?
Well, I was saying because of what he's polling. He's taking a bit more away from Donald Trump than he is Joe Biden. It's interesting because obviously we're talking about a lot of his policies, and we can get a little bit more deeper into that. We're talking about favorability and being an alternative. We don't want to go in personal beliefs or whatnot. How often do you find a person that, excluding politics, is left-leaning on everything or right-leaning on everything? They kind of feel like they're in the middle for the most part. But I agree with you. I think a lot of why he takes away voters from Trump is because of some of his other policies. Like you said, he's trying to be less establishment, to kind of de-establish. He's against the establishment. He wants those smaller businesses, but he's made favor small businesses, anti-monopoly. Also, he is pro-union, which is it's very interesting that he kind of has the Republican side of not letting the government really control the businesses, but he wants smaller businesses to thrive, and he's against these big monopolies. But he also wants he's also very much in favor of unions. Like you said, he's a big into immigration. He will not take away. He's not against the Second Amendment. But there's some other there's one policy I want to talk about in particular because it's something, and he even said this himself, and it's something that'll be developing. One of the things that RFK Jr. is into that not a lot of presidents or really politicians have been advocating or promoting for. He even went to a conference in Denver, I think, a little over a week ago, I want to say. It's talking about cryptocurrency. Now, at the time, right today, actually, Bitcoin hit a record high. I think it was $68,000 something dollar. I forget the exact dollar amount. It hit $68,000 of Bitcoin, which is the highest it had. And it's also crazy to think about because about less than a year ago, it was at its lowest, or 2 years ago, it was at its lowest around 20,000. So it's skied high, exponentially has exceeded new heights. Okay? Mm-hmm. And the quote he had was, transactional freedom is important as a freedom of expression. He also said that he's trying to cater to the middle class because this gives them another avenue of, generating wealth that isn't kind of reliant upon. He said it gives them another avenue of wealth also that isn't really taxed, he said. And it kind of is coinciding with what the SEC is saying now, that they're more in favor of Bitcoin. They're allowing these more public trades. So I wanted to get your thought on it because I think a lot of the other policies swing in either direction, but I think this is the one thing that he's really stood out against, especially Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
So you mentioned a point there. You said that Bitcoin as an avenue for creating wealth. I assume among the newer generations, or really any American who's interested. I'll be honest with you, I don't know very much about cryptocurrency, but what I can comment on is that there are a number of different concerns, not just in the regulation of said cryptocurrencies, not just Bitcoin. There are many other, of course, but there's also the concern of a potential central bank digital currency. I'm not sure if that's an issue that you might be interested in discussing, but he was on a podcast where he did discuss this, and so a lot of the, I guess I would say, a central point of his platform is about creating wealth in this new generation, because he says, well, you look at the generations and the wealth has been basically plummeting. He wants to put every American, every young American, millennial American, I suppose, in a home. That is one of his policy points, and that's one point that he's running on, and he continues to repeat. So I suppose, and also one more thing there is what he continues to blame is these three, as you called them, mega monopolies, the BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, who are responsible for having cash offers for homes and basically outbidding anyone who is looking to purchase a home. And so it's interesting there because that's something that it's not necessarily an issue that's being called out by every candidate. I haven't heard Biden or actually Trump mention these points, but in particular, RFK is dropping the names of these mega monopolies, as you've mentioned, and I find that to be a very unique point of his platform. I think what I'd like to ask you is sort of, where do you see is there a unique point of his platform that maybe Trump or Biden are not offering that voters who are interested in RFK Jr. as a candidate might be going after or interested in hearing?
I do think so, because and that's what I alluded to earlier. RFK Jr. There obviously are a couple of concerns with an independent candidate. You really I'll do a couple of concerns first. One, especially if you're in a voter in a swing state, you're weary of your vote, swinging your vote the wrong way by voting an independent.
Mm-hmm.
I also think there are some big his stance on his vaccine stance is very controversial. I'll put it at that. But I do think he does offer a unique position because, like you said, he kind of caters towards both sides, and a lot of people, they may lean a little to the left, a little to the right, but they usually don't lean all the way to the left, or all the way to the right, I did it again, all the way to the right, all the way to the left. And so there's certain policies like, you'd be like, I like the fact that he is an environmentalist, but I'm also someone who, let's say, I'm just going to take this example. I'm someone who is in favor of stopping the establishments, kind of allowing the businesses to kind of operate themselves, not be overregulated by government. But I'm also an environmentalist. So there's policies that can cater to multiple people, and so you don't have to be all in on the left, all in on the right, which I think is unique to really any candidate we've seen in recent memory.
He's looking for a compromise between both sides. I mean, if you really want to make changes and you want action, you're always going to have an unhappy party. You're going to have the people who, if we look at if either Biden or Trump succeed in the election in come November, yeah, you're going to have a lot of angry people no matter what the outcome might be. Now, you look at RFK Jr., yeah, I think that it's going to definitely shake up what is currently going on in D.C. And it's just interesting to see because not only, well, I'll switch up with this. There's one thing that I wanted to mention because you had brought up the conspiracy theorist and the anti-vax claims. So a lot of these claims come from this one particular point where he had written a book. The book is called The Real Anthony Fauci. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
Yes.
I think at one point on Amazon it was the number one selling book, released in 2021. A few of the topics covered: pharmaceutical industry, the corruption within it, infectious diseases, of course having to do with COVID, very timely subject, and Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, and another number of other things. And so a lot of the claims come from that point. And I guess what we all have to learn from this is that, yeah, you should read from articles on both sides that essentially have a bias on the left, a bias on the right, and you find yourself reading from multiple perspectives. But the stress is to do your own research, and in order to learn most about a candidate is to hear it from themselves. And I would encourage anybody who's trying to learn about any candidate ahead of November, just to find out yourself. If there are podcasts like RFK, then sit down for 2 hours, take out some time on the weekend, and sort of get informed about the candidate. And if you disagree with them, that's totally fine, as long as perhaps you've learned something and walked away with some information, some knowledge there.
I think that is a great way to kind of segue out of this conversation. We're going to take a quick break, but we're going to have Ryan Johnston and Jackson Shank discuss the two main candidates of this 2024 election cycle. As part of our preview, they'll be discussing Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. You've been listening to the election night coverage here on 89.5 FM WSOU. We'll be right back after this short break. Take care.
Welcome back in the studios of 89.5 FM WSOU. Once again, Ryan Johnston here with you, bringing you more action of WSOU's election night coverage. Starting things off, I want to talk about Nikki Haley in Vermont. She's really making moves. Up by around 4% right now in what we're seeing coming in. New York Times needle is inching closer and closer to calling it for her. No news yet there, but I think it reflects a trend that we're seeing across the primaries in a large way, Jackson, she's taken some votes. It's not as dominant as I would have expected. She's hovering in that 20 to 30 range in a number of states: North Carolina, Virginia, Massachusetts, Maine, Minnesota, Colorado. I mean, pretty comprehensive list, all things considered. And I think it really begs the question going into 2024 of what's the Republican unity like surrounding, obviously, Donald Trump. How do you think they'll back him in 2024?
Well, Ryan, you got to wonder where those votes are going to go, right? Because that doesn't always mean that vote, or I guess at this point, it's more likely when Donald Trump takes the cake on the Republican side of things, where those votes are going to follow. Because it doesn't mean they're going to instantly go to him. I mean, there may be people who are voting for Nikki Haley who choose not to vote, or who maybe take that vote away, or who knows? Who knows where it's going to go? So that unification process is something that I think Trump's going to have to build more during his presidential election run and over these months after he's declared the Republican candidate. Once that decision is made clear, I think that has to be his biggest target audience, is how can I take the Nikki Haley supporters and that 20, sometimes 30% in different states and turn it around and make sure that they're behind me.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the thing with Donald Trump is, I'll put it this way, he's very straightforward, right? And in terms of his opponents, he can get a little bit personal at times. Now, his supporters really like it, but he's personal against his primary opponents as well.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be interesting to see how that turns around into the 2024 election in general. Looking at that election, let's just say Trump versus Biden right
Absolutely.
now. Obviously, RFK could throw a wrench in things, as
Who
Ryan
knows?
and Jorge were just having a lovely conversation about. But assuming that it's Trump versus Biden, it's the first time we've seen the incumbent versus a former president since, I believe, 1912.
It's been a while.
Theodore Roosevelt versus William Howard Taft. Roosevelt obviously winning that one, but it gives you a unique perspective on how voters are viewing their policies. According to the New York Times, 40% of registered voters are saying Trump's policies have helped them personally, while only 18% are saying Biden's policies have helped them personally. Keep in mind, this is during a time when Biden's approval ratings are, as they mentioned, one of the lowest in history. And they're also citing that a lot of it is about the economy. So I get the desire to blame the president for things that are going wrong with the economy, but a lot of it is not necessarily within his control, right? The inflation that was going on was worldwide. It wasn't just in America, and it was exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine. Major producers of grain in Ukraine, I think Joe and Liam were citing a stat about the price of crackers.
Yeah.
That's a direct correlation right there, if you will.
Yes.
And Russia being a major producer of oil, especially to the European Union, them not being able to... They had to cut off that source for a little bit, raising prices on a lot of different things. The Federal Reserve, in response, has raised interest rates to a very, very high level, and you've seen that inflation number start to come down. Now, it hasn't... Last month, it didn't come down quite as much as they were hoping for. Estimates were hoping that inflation consumer price index year over year would be about 2.9%. It came in at about 3.1%, so a bit hotter than expected. But you also have a non-farm payroll of 350,000 plus jobs added in January, which was way higher than estimates. I mean, it just blew estimates out of the water. So you've got this this sort of mixed economic picture for Biden right now. And like Joe said, I think a lot of Americans are just sort of seeing it as, this is what I'm paying. What I'm paying is higher. The president must fix it.
Well, I mean, it's easy to blame, the man in the castle, right? I mean, he's the one person that you have to target. You can't really take a look at like who's surrounding him. He's going to take all the blame, whether or not he did something wrong or someone within house did something wrong. Like, more often than not, if you're the head of something, you're going to take the blame for the actions down below or the actions surrounding you. So, like you said, there are a lot of factors that go around with total reformation of the entire economy, right? So not entirely is it all in Biden's control. Some of it is obviously the creation of jobs. I would say that is in his control, and being as that there's more jobs in America than there have ever been in the history of the United States as of right now, I would say that's a huge step forward. So when you as my old baseball coach used to tell me, control the things that you can control, right? When it comes to the economy, how do you find ways to create jobs? What can you do to make sure that people can earn money in ways that aren't really traditional? Like, one of the things that you talked about in that survey or in that discussion where you were talking about Trump's policies helping versus Biden's, I mean, Trump had tax cuts and deregulation that were significant and that helped roll back numerous regulations. So when you look at that stems economic growth as well. So what kind of things are benefiting one versus the other?
Well, one way that I think that you can really measure their policies was their response to the coronavirus, right?
Yes.
Biden put in the stimulus package. The full name was the American Rescue Plan Act, but it included those $1,400 stimuluses, whereas Trump focused more on the macro picture. He was increasing unemployment insurance, granting those loans out to businesses, which reportedly had a fair amount of fraud.
Yep.
Fair amount of fraud with that. And so I do have to question how much of it is people saying, before coronavirus, when Trump was in charge, the economy was pretty strong. Unemployment was falling, and GDP was growing. And how much of that is looking back at those pre-COVID times with rose-tinted glasses, do you think?
Ryan, it's a really good question. What I would say is that my dad works in finances. He's a financial advisor, so his job is to study the various markets, and they're affected by the economy. And one thing that he mentioned to me is that Trump, when he got into office and throughout the slight boom in the economy that he had right before the recession in 2020, was that he rolled into a fairly solid economy coming out of the 2016 election. And as much as you can take it comes back to that, what have you done specifically to make sure that those things happen, whereas the total economy's growth is just on a trajectory. And more often than not, I would say from that 2016 to 2020 era, that the economy was already in a pretty decent spot. So he managed to build off that, which, yes, credit to him, but it starts in a really good foundation. I would say it's probably a lot harder for the Biden administration to come into a situation where they're coming into a recession. I mean, 2020, the coronavirus.
Recession.
Right.
I do wonder how much of that job growth that you saw immediately when Biden came into office was just the natural return
of people to their day-to-day lives. Yeah.
I do wonder that. I do have some breaking news, though. Nikki Haley officially projected to win Vermont, according to the New York Times. They're calling it for her 50% to 46% right now. For Trump, she's got around 2,500 votes more. And you've got to think this gives at least some more legs to her campaign, that she'll probably see it a large part of the way through.
Well, we were talking before this, us as a group, and we were wondering the odds of what were the chances for her to win something besides D.C. that she had already taken. And we all thought that the chances were pretty slim, but although Vermont is the least impactful, there's hope, right? This is a scenario where not even the slightest or the smallest states, electoral college or delegates aside, it matters, because when it comes down to it, you're unifying, I guess, one half of the country when you think about it, depending on how many are registered Republicans versus registered Democrats. And you have a job as the representative for one party to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Because if you have trouble in your own house, what does it say about you trying to go up against someone who has things in order on the other side of the pond? So I think it's a huge win for Nikki Haley, and in any chance that she wants to continue to run in the future, or maybe make another run at it, I think this gives her a sign of life. She's a lot younger than the candidates. That's been one thing that she's preached throughout her entire run. It's like, oh my gosh, how can we put these two people who are way too old to be in office again? Joe Biden's the oldest president in the history of the United States. He's 81 years old. Trump's not far behind him, right? He hasn't hit the 80 mark yet, but he's pretty darn close.
So and he's 77.
Right, and if he is going to go into office, he's going to be over that 80 mark. So just a couple things from Haley's run, and credit to her on a huge win in Vermont.
You know, that age factor has been a huge part of the conversation about Trump and Biden. New York Times poll is saying 47% of all registered voters think that strongly agree that Joe Biden is too old to be an effective president. 26% somewhat agree. For Trump, that's 21% strongly agree, 21% somewhat agree. He's got a 32% saying they strongly disagree with that statement. Obviously, Trump has a very strong core of supporters. But what do you think this data means for the moderate, for the average American? Could you see more swing towards an RFK?
You know, I don't know if it's going to take one away over the other. But what I will say, Ryan, is that I think this is why candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy have such a huge or such a short peak or spike and come back down to earth, is because I think younger Americans, especially our demographic, are hungry for someone who they can really relate to. Those new voters who are coming in and finding their way at the ripe age of 18 to, people like myself who are 21 years old and didn't get a chance to vote in the last election because their birthday was in January of the year, right? You're looking for someone really who you can relate to, right? Jorge just got done talking about how you can go listen to RFK for 2 hours on his podcast. That's something that you're not going to get with Donald Trump or President Biden. I will say Trump's Twitter feed was probably one of the best things he could have done for his young votership. It sometimes clearly hurt him more than it helped him. I mean, we all remember January 6th, but there's got to be a way to tap into different demographics, and even those who are, turning 30, 40 years old. You're seeing someone twice your age run the country, and it's been pretty clear. We haven't seen anything from Trump, and I think that goes to show why people maybe believe that he's more suitable at his age, at least just by an age disparity, that he can more functionally run the country, because we have seen it with Joe Biden. We have seen those slip-ups, those moments where we maybe, tilt our head a little bit and we're like, hey, is it all there, or what happened here? Why is he making this comment, or how did he transition from this thought to the other? And that's gonna sway people's voting when it comes down to the average American. It's tough because we're not going to know if the age is the reason why, or if it's other factors in general. I would say being a functional human being is probably the first baby step that you have to have in order to be the president of the United States. So I would say it plays some sort of factor.
One more quick thing before we head to break. Joe and Liam earlier were talking about the immigration policies under Joe Biden and how, we've seen record numbers of illegal immigrants coming into the United States, undocumented immigrants. And you have to think that plays a major role in the voting of a swing state like Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, when you have people who are set in their ways, one way or the other, where we have the United States based around, the idea of the American dream and the middle class, and saying, hey, people can find their way to work into, I would say, a sustainable life here. You have some people who believe that anyone should be given that opportunity because we're America, we have the resources for it. If people want to find a way into our country and they're having difficulty in others, that they should be supported here and they should be uplifted and they should have opportunities. And you have other people who say, hey, whoa, wait a minute. I understand that I might have been born here and therefore that may have gotten me a head start above other people in this world, but we can't just go around handing everything out the same way. U.S. citizenship is such an important topic in this country because we have to understand who is going to be the foundation of our country. Is it going to be that working class who has found their way into U.S. citizenship, or is it going to be those who are born here and have used that to their fullest advantage? It's a really tough topic to cover. One regime clearly restricts it over another. And I think based on how those southern states feel and based on the situations they're in currently, it's going to heavily impact the way that those swing come November.
Pew Research data showing that over Donald Trump's presidency, illegal immigration had flatlined, if not declined slightly. Meantime, during Joe Biden, you're having record arrests for illegal immigrants crossing the border in a month. Fox News espousing numbers as 7 million or so illegal immigrants. So definitely going to be an area of concern for the Biden administration as we get set for the 2024 campaign tour. But we're going to take a quick break on the WSOU FM election coverage. You're listening to WSOU FM in South Orange, New Jersey. Keep it locked.
In 2021, WSOU's Election Night Show won the New York Press Club Award for Metro political coverage. Now, Election Night is back this Super Tuesday at 8 p.m. for one of the most important dates on the political calendar. Tune in for live results and hear our analysts break down the 2024 presidential election cycle only on 89.5 FM WSOU.
Super Tuesday coverage for the election night is still going on here on 89.5 FM WSOU. My name is Liam Harding. Alongside me is Joseph Morales. And Joe, getting into it, we kind of talked about her throughout the night, the quintessential, the last, object many people believe standing between Donald Trump and the Republican nomination, Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley has quite the name to herself. She was a former governor of South Carolina from 2011 to 2017. She served as an ambassador to the United Nations from 2017 to 2018. She was the first Indian American to serve in a presidential cabinet. She obviously is a Republican Party presidential candidate, and she won the Washington, D.C. primary just the other day on March the 3rd, becoming the first woman to win a Republican presidential primary in U.S. history. Quite the resume there. Speaking of that, she also just won Vermont, having 3,684 votes to Donald Trump's 30,469, giving her the majority, and 17 delegates received. So, Joe, she's just making history, trailblazing for a lot of people here, in the world.
Yeah, I think this shows that she can win a couple of these states and give Trump a run for his money. Now, I don't think it's going to end up in her representing the Republican Party in the general election, but she's showing that she can take away some delegates from Trump, and if she wants to propel this into a future presidential run, it's like in real life, if you run for something, get your face known, get your feet wet. That's what Nikki Haley's doing right now for a future presidential run. Now, yes, she wants to represent the Republican Party in 2024. The chances of that happening, Liam, are pretty unlikely. But she's well-equipped to go on a run in 2028, in 2032, in 2036. She has years, she has experience, and in a couple years, it wouldn't shock me if she's representing the party in general.
You were right there, Joe. As, Jorge and Anthony said to start us off in this coverage, looking at a lot of these other candidates not named Donald Trump, like Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley, they're young. They have they're getting their names out. They're getting their, testing the waters, getting their feet wet a little, just so, they can go on further down the road in their careers in politics to make a run for, the presidential nominee. But right now, Haley is the only, real threat or real obstacle for Donald Trump to, get over to get and seal the deal and, get the Republican nomination. And although she isn't, getting all the votes and she's not winning a tad bit, she's still getting, 30, 40%, which in the grand scheme of things, a lot of people in the Republican Party like that about her. She's getting all these, this voting because it's giving those voice of people who don't identify with Donald Trump, who don't think he should be the candidate to represent their views out there. And this Reagan, after former President Ronald Reagan, this Reagan group of Republicans who might have voted for Donald Trump the first two times around, but no, he is not the answer. They see themselves with Nikki Haley.
Here's the funny thing, Liam. I think there's a good majority of Republicans in 2024 that don't align as Trump Republicans. I think there's a big majority that identify in that realm of traditional Republican. And if you aren't a Trump Republican, who is your alternative right now? I don't think Nikki Haley lines up as a traditional Republican. That option is not here right now. I think Ron DeSantis was a good representation of that. Ted Cruz, although he didn't run, that was a good representation of that in 2016. There's a divide in the party, Liam, between Trump Republicans and traditional conservatives. And if that isn't healed before November, then Joe Biden is elected into a second term. If Trump Republicans and traditional Republicans can come together like they did in 2016, then Donald Trump will be president in November. Now, will that happen, Liam? I'm starting to think yes, it will, because Nikki Haley is not polling right. She's not polling positively. And the opposition to Donald Trump within his own party dropped out very early, before Super Tuesday. I'm trying to think back to 2016. Ted Cruz was in it during Super Tuesday. John Kasich held on for a while. I'm trying to remember some other Republican candidates that year. But those are the two that stick out to me. Marco Rubio was around. I'm not sure if he dropped out before Super Tuesday. But there were more options in 2016. Now, are you going to tell me that Republicans are favoring the Trump style of conservatism. Yes, I think the movement has started, and it's bigger than where it was before Trump was elected. But I still do think there's a strong base of traditional Republicans that have wanted to give Trump a run for his money, but the candidate isn't there this year. So they're settling for Donald Trump in a general election against Joe Biden.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right there, Joe. I definitely see, the movement shifting in a way to reflect more towards Donald Trump, but for more of these traditional conservatives, like, they kind of coined themselves the term of a Reagan Republican, per se. Think about, former President Ronald Reagan, and during his time, trying to get elected. There isn't that option. That's what Nikki Haley is being used for. It's in all of these articles I read while preparing for this. They said Haley gives them that voice because they don't necessarily see themselves aligning with Trump's values as president, but they all don't want to, completely turn their backs away from the Republican Party.
And that's the basis that Nikki Haley is trying to run on. It's clearly not working, and people clearly not responding to it. But she's trying to be the alternate voice from Trump. She's trying to be the opposition, and she's trying to say, if you don't align politically within the Republican Party with Donald Trump, I'm your option. But clearly that isn't working, Liam. It didn't work in 2016. Now, Ted Cruz tried. Ted Cruz was Trump's biggest opposition in 2016, in the primaries at least. It didn't work then. It's not working now. Have we really shifted to a full-on... Let me rephrase that. Is the Trump style of conservatism the new style of conservatism? Is it a younger, more passionate style of conservatism? Like, I compare this back in 2020, before that 2016, with an AOC type of the Democratic side. That is my comparison to a Trump Republican. It's a little more extreme than traditionalists. And the Joe Biden type of the Democrats is more aligned with a Ted Cruz or a John Kasich or a Nikki Haley. That's more traditional. But the parties have started to drift so far apart that they're so extreme nowadays, Liam. For right or for wrong. They are so far apart ideologically. And that's how you have a Trump Republican, and that's why the Democratic Party is shifting in favor of an AOC or an Ihad Omar. It's going that way. So that's where the divide is happening within the party. It's
just like evolution, with everything.
Absolutely.
Animals evolve.
For right or for wrong.
Well, exactly. You say, Joe. The thing with Nikki Haley, though, unlike Ted Cruz, who you've just, mentioned quite a few times, she chose an alternative approach when coming to campaign. Unlike, Rob DeSantis, Ted Cruz in the past, and all these other former candidates, she never targeted Trump, directly.
Right.
It wasn't until, more recently when it became, the two of them are the only real options. They're only competing against each other now. And she said that from the beginning. She wasn't going to go and direct herself at Trump until it's just the two of them and the rest of the candidates bowed out. So that's a different approach because she hasn't really gone and said anything. She said things about Donald Trump, but it wasn't anything like 100% negative. It wasn't necessarily directed solely at him. It was like a grand scheme of things. And she at the same time does say, she will support him if, she loses.
But at the end of the day, I think that's what brought Nikki Haley's one of the reasons that brought Nikki Haley's campaign down. The only way a Republican, aside from Donald Trump, was going to represent the party is if they went for his legs, Liam. You had to go for him quickly and you had to go for him early. You had to shut that down. And the Republicans just couldn't. And that's why Donald Trump is going to represent the party. Now, I know Nikki Haley wanted to take, I'm going to use quotes, the high road. She tried to. But that is not the style of approach that she should have taken if she wanted to be taken more seriously in the primaries, Liam.
Well,
in my opinion.
We'll have to agree to disagree because I feel like a lot of these other candidates who have targeted him and tried taking him out of his legs, as you said, have failed because all his energy and all his efforts is focused solely on taking those people down. Whereas, Nikki Haley was able to, get that old school kind of conservative, the Ronald Reagan conservative, per se, to become donors. And, she was starting to, be able to put her name out there. So, as you alluded to at the beginning of this, she may not win. She's not going to get the nomination, most likely, unless things start, turning her way. However, this is setting the stage for her in 2032, all these years looking down the line.
And I also think, Liam, that Republicans who are fed up with the Biden administration, who look at all the flaws in the administration, like we talked about earlier with the pros and cons, Liam. They look at that, and they ask themselves, who has a better chance of beating Joe Biden in a general election? Donald Trump or Nikki Haley? Now, both of them have not proven to beat Joe Biden. Donald Trump loses. Nikki Haley never got her opportunity. But they ask themselves, who is the stronger, now I want to call him politician, the stronger representative of my party who can take down Joe Biden? And the Republican Party spoke, and they found that Nikki Haley was not the strongest one to take down Joe Biden in an election.
Yeah, exactly. I see what you're saying there, Joe, especially in the grand scheme of things. But now, as you were talking about how earlier on when we were last on, we talked about, the pros and cons of Biden's administration,
right,
looking at his policies per se. It's time, I think, to compare Nikki Haley and Trump. We've been just saying about their campaign trails, but let's dive into where do they differ in ideologies and these policies, starting looking at border crisis and immigration per se. Haley has backed immigration policies, including a return with Title 42, which was Trump's remain in Mexico policy, and increased deportation, which isn't all that talked about that much. Whereas you look at Donald Trump, his solution is including the construction of the wall, reinstating remain in Mexico and Title 42, and increased deportations as well. Two things that they both are very similar policies, but again, one's only harped on more than Nikki Haley's.
Well, what the other thing is, too? People know what they're getting into with Donald Trump. They know what type of border policies and border enforcement they're getting with Donald Trump. And whether you like it or not, he's very passionate about the southern border. And he's going to continue to be. So that's, again, not to tie this back, it's another reason why people are favoring Trump more than Haley. They know what they're getting in Donald Trump. They find that Donald Trump is stronger on immigration, on economic policies, and foreign affairs than Nikki Haley. And they can back that up by looking at the Trump presidency. They feel that Donald Trump was better with Russia, with North Korea, with the Middle East, than Nikki Haley can be if she's elected. They feel he's better with the economics as well. Trump has talked about reopening the pipeline. He's talked about different types of energy usage than what Joe Biden's doing right now. All of that stuff can be backed up by what he did in 4 years. So that's the main difference between Trump and Nikki Haley here.
It's interesting that when you mentioned these policies, the first ones you mentioned are border crisis, immigration, the wars going on in Ukraine and Russia, Palestine and Israel. But one thing you didn't mention that's, in America, that especially with almost our demographic of voters, is gun control. And shockingly enough, it seems like Donald Trump is more, the aggressor in terms of having stricter gun laws. Haley has spoken out about it, but she, in terms of school shootings, she has just said, let's get more metal detectors and increase mental health care as opposed to gun control. Whereas Trump has, not explicitly said anything, no specifics on his gun control policies. However, he did tell the NRA that nobody would come for their guns under his watch, and then told Iowa residents that after a school shooting that they just need to get over it. So it's a tale of two stories per se.
This goes back to Trump. If you didn't know this, Donald Trump was not always a Republican. He was a Democrat for a while. He was an independent before that. And one of the things he had to overcome in 2016 was prove to the traditional Republican that he can be right-leaning. But you're not going to change a man what he truly thinks. Donald Trump does not, or let me rephrase that. Donald Trump is not as passionate about the Second Amendment than Nikki Haley is, or more traditional right-wing Republicans. So he's going to favor that a little more than Nikki Haley has. That's where those differ, Liam, in my opinion. Nikki Haley is a little stronger on the rights of the people to use their Second Amendment right. Donald Trump is a little more, I want to call him left-leaning on that, but he's more of a centrist on that topic, in my opinion.
Yeah, so again, both under the Republican umbrella, but, vastly different in some of these policies. in terms of, as we just mentioned, gun control, immigration laws, all sorts of serious topics like that. But then, in less serious, not as less serious, all these policies are very serious for the future of this country, the future of, all future voters. But one of them that people kind of, throw to the wayside is education. And, Donald Trump has stated that he would shut down the Department of Ed and defer policies to the states. He's been opposed to critical race theory in schools, and then through college level subject is not part of K through 12 curriculums. He wants, all these different things for education and just getting rid of that department. Whereas Haley has, spoken in support of giving parents more say in how schools are run and promised to reduce the size of the Department of Education. She still wants it to be that governing body. So do you think, in the future, with these stances she has, is it going to make it these races for these other candidates something to look forward to? Is that going to be like, a defining thing is these minuscule topics that kind of, get thrown to the wayside? Or do you think it's just going to continue to be those main topics like gun control, immigration, border control, all that sort of stuff?
Education is always going to come up, and it's an interesting subject, too. Because, education, yeah. Did I say immigration or education?
You said education.
I meant to say education if I did say immigration. Education is always going to be an issue with the states and how they decide to run education. Now, the government does have some say, yes, but the school boards and the school districts at the state level are going to have a more of a say than the federal government does. Now, if states can bring that power and make it more of a local government issue, then you're right, Liam, where they don't have to worry about it as much and they're going to focus on the bigger issues. But education still is a very important issue, Liam, and it's going to be talked about until it's figured out, especially when it comes to schools that don't have as good of reading levels, graduation rates. Schools like that are going to be put under the microscope and talked about on a national level when it comes to education.
Now, we've talked about these policies and the importance of them, the crux of them, especially, again, Joe, just the whole immigration border control has almost been the center, especially in terms of how vocal Donald Trump's been about it, especially before he got in office, when he was in office, and most certainly now, as we mentioned earlier, with the rise of 8.2 million illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants. Do you think because of how vocal Donald Trump's been with issues like that for so long, compared to that Nikki Haley, who I feel like many of us, including myself, kind of just heard of when it came to this election area, is that why Donald Trump voters go towards him more than her? Or do you think there's like any other underlying issue that it could be?
No, I think it sticks with Trump there, Liam. He's more passionate when it comes to issues like that. And again, that's what I was saying before. They know what they're getting with Donald Trump, which plays against Nikki Haley. Like, looking back on it, Nikki Haley was at already a huge disadvantage against Trump because Trump had 4 years under his belt and could tell the American people, hey, here's what I did in 4 years, and here's what I can continue to do in the next 4. That's what that goes back to, Liam. It's an issue of one person has experience and the other person doesn't. And people are going to tend to side with the person with experience because it's a given and they know what they're getting from them.
Yeah, that definitely is a big factor in terms of, knowing what you get. One thing, is the common conception with politicians is that, they're going to say one thing, they're good at shaking hands and kissing babies, but, the minute they get in office, sometimes those first 100 days, you learn the truth real quickly about these important policies. So someone like Donald Trump, who is in your face, who says what he means and acts on it, is definitely something there. But I think another area of emphasis on why some of these Trump voters aren't really aligning with Nikki Haley and her ideology is just almost that people have been calling her almost two-faced per se because of how she, like other candidates, go about certain things. She'll say one thing about stance on something and then go back on it, especially when she talks about her heritage. She is the daughter of Indian immigrants. And, that has been a main focal point in her career, a main focal point of, her political platform. But at times, on the campaign trail, she'd be like, it's not that big emphasis of me in terms of racism, when she'd be like, hey, I don't want, there was an article and they said that there's a quoted from her saying, I don't want people of color, children of color to feel like that there is racism in this country. As I grew up without feeling that sense of racism, and then a few days later, she then turns it around and talks about how children need to realize this, and racism is a quintessential part of what America is and needs to change. It's in the essence of America, but needs to change. So again, people have been saying that because of that, like, I wouldn't say two-faced, even though I said that before. How easy it is for her to flip the script per se, has been something that's kind of deterred Trump supporters from jumping ship to her.
Absolutely. The American people hear everything, Liam, especially during an election cycle. Everything you say, as they say in the court of law, everything you say will be used against you. Everything. It's under a microscope, especially in today's day and age, with Twitter, with 24-hour news coverage. Everything you say as a major political candidate in a presidential year will be taken and used against you. So Nikki Haley, again, she's not going to win this year. If she runs in 28 or 32, she needs to take these lessons, pocket them, and fix the problems that she has in the future years. Because you're under a microscope, Liam. You can't say whatever you want. People are going to hear it, and they're going to use it against you. That's something Nikki Haley's got to clean up.
Exactly right there, Joe. You're listening to Super Tuesday coverage on 89.5 FM WSOU. And right before we wrap up this segment, Joe, just one last thing for you. Do you think there are any viable Republican candidates that, could be used, or is it, as we kept kind of talking about throughout this whole little segment, that this is going to be a 28-32 type of issue, that there's no one that can stand up to Trump right now?
This year, no. But Donald Trump has a big say in what the future of this party looks like, I think, by picking his vice president. If he picks a young vice president that is favored by the people, that's why a Vivek is an interesting choice for him. Because I think Vivek's going to be president one day, to be completely honest with you, Liam. If he takes him as a vice president and can stick through him, unlike what he did with Pence, those two don't seem to like each other anymore. But if they could stick through it, Liam, the future of the Republican Party can go whichever way Donald Trump says it does. So he has a very important decision to make with his vice presidential candidate.
I agree with you, Joe. I don't think there is anyone right now, Nikki Haley, Vivek, Robert Kennedy Jr. I don't think there's anyone right now that can stand up to Donald Trump, and it'll be something for 28 or 32, but the vice president is going to be something quite important for this campaign and for the future of the Republican Party. That'll do it for Joe and I on this quick little segment, but stay tuned to 89.5 FM WSOU as the Super Tuesday coverage will continue after this short break.
Welcome back in the studios, 89.5 FM WSOU, wrapping up our election coverage tonight on Super Tuesday. Ryan Johnston and Jackson Shank back with you. One final preview of the 2024 election, where Jackson, Donald Trump is leading Joe Biden in just about every single swing state by a pretty healthy margin.
It's definitely cause for concern for the current president of the United States. When you take a look at it, Ryan, you and I were doing the research beforehand, and I mean, every time we were looking at a new state, it was Trump by 4%, Trump by 5%, Trump by 2% in some states, but things are turning red, and that has been the story so far. I mean, we're early. We are heavily early in the look at the 2024 election, and I mean, we have yet to name a Republican candidate. I know that is all but done at this point, but yeah, let's not get ahead of ourselves. But for right now, the voters have been in favor of former President Donald Trump.
Even in a state like Georgia, where Biden won in 2020, he flipped it from the 2016 election. Trump won there by 5.1%. In 2020, Biden won by 0.3%. I mean, Trump caught a RICO charge for his activities post-election in Georgia, and yet he's still in the lead by a very healthy margin, nearly double digits.
Yeah, he's crushing. He's crushing in Georgia. And, I mean, I wonder why. When you take a look at someone who is, I mean, we spent an entire segment on this earlier, Ryan and Dovid talking about the criminal trials that he's going through and how he's just managed to continually beat the allegations or manage to stay afloat. He was unanimously passed by the Supreme Court to be on the ballot in Colorado, as you know, Colorado was trying to make a federal move to possibly remove him from the ballot in specific states and start a movement, and they got denied. So things are moving positively in Trump's direction, and I think that is why more and more people are getting behind him. If he continues to prove and dismiss these charges, then I mean, people are going to start rallying behind him, because then he has a clean sheet and he can move forward.
Redfield and Wilton showing that Trump has leads in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And if he wins all of those states,
I mean, it's over.
It'd be a pretty difficult path for Joe Biden to return to the White House.
They call them the swing states for a reason. The election if it's a tight race, which my guess is in the coming years that it's going to be. I mean, it came down to the wire in the last election, so these are the states that are going to matter. You talk about Trump making sure that he unifies that Republican Party. If he's managing to win each state without even doing it, you wonder what that turnout's going to be like if and when he does unite the Republican Party. Because we were talking earlier about Nikki Haley and the possibility that those voters maybe won't go with Trump or maybe won't push that Republican vote forward in specific states. But as of now, Trump's managing to hold on without it. And just goes to show, the way that people feel about the current president or the representation that the Republican Party is showing in the early polls.
Yeah, it's definitely looking like an interesting time for Biden supporters. Trump's got a healthy lead, and it's still early. And considering Biden's approval rating right now, I don't really know what he's going to be able to do in order to overcome that.
These last 6 months, Ryan, I think are going to be make or break for the Biden administration in order to push his drive for a second term forward. If he can manage to, year 3 to 4 is when we see the most impact from policies that an administration has put in. If he can manage to swing this thing differently in the next couple of months, I mean, he has the power to make changes, and if he can, turn that corner in these final 6 months, maybe that changes. Maybe we see something different. Maybe we see resolutions in other parts of the world that stabilizes the economy a little bit more. But for right now, it's not looking pretty.
Checking in on Super Tuesday, California called for Donald Trump. He currently has a very, very healthy lead there. And Utah still far too early to call, but Donald Trump about doubling up Nikki Haley in the early votes that we've seen. So the big story today, Nikki Haley taking Vermont from Donald Trump, the first state that she's won. She's also taken Washington, D.C. Interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that propels her campaign forward. But for all of us at WSOU, thanks so much for tuning in to our election night coverage. Nikki Haley looking to come through in the clutch in a couple of states. Speaking of clutch, they're coming up next.